Have you ever driven past a church at night and seen the padlock on the outside of the door and thought, for just a second, that is the wrong side? Not a mistake. Not vandalism. A padlock on the outside of a church door, installed with a hasp and 3-inch screws and painted over so many times the paint has built up in rings around the shackle, like the rings of a tree. Have you ever stood in front of a building where people go to pray and understood, in a way that sat in your stomach and not in your head, that the lock was not there to keep anyone out? There is a town in the Ozarks where they have been doing that for 119 years, every night. 7 nights a week. A man walks up the limestone steps at dusk and puts a lock on the front door of a church that has been standing since 1878, and he walks around to the side door and puts a second lock on that, and he walks around to the back, where there is a root cellar door set into the foundation, and he puts a third lock on that. And then he walks home, and he does not look back, and he has been doing it since he was 19 years old. And his father did it before him, and his father's mother did it before that. They do not lock it to protect the silver, because there is no silver. They do not lock it to keep out drifters, because there are no drifters on that road, because nobody drives that road after dark if they have ever driven it once before. They lock it because of what the church does at night when there is no one in it. They lock it because of what happens to the hymnal pages. They lock it because the pews are not always in the same place in the morning, and because the candle wax on the altar sometimes spells out names, and because in 1951 a woman named Ada Jessamine Pruitt unlocked that church at 6 in the morning on a Sunday and found, sitting in the third pew from the front on the left side, a pair of reading glasses that had been buried with her husband 14 months before. I am going to tell you about that church. I am going to tell you about the town it sits in, and the people who built it, and the 14 ministers who have served it, and the 3 of those 14 who did not leave on their own terms. I am going to tell you about the thing under the foundation, and I am going to tell you what a woman named Nora Selwick found when she went there in the fall of 1997 to do a job that should have taken 2 weeks, and what happened to her in those 2 weeks, and what she has been doing every night since, for 27 years, that her neighbors have noticed and never asked about. There is one thing I will not be able to explain to you. I will tell you now so you can watch for it. There are 22 pews in that church, 11 on each side of the center aisle. In the photographs taken in 1979 by a county assessor, there are 22. In the photographs taken in 1997 by Nora Selwick, there are 22. But in the photographs taken by a deputy sheriff named Lyle Ott on the morning of the 19th of October, 1997, at 7:45 a.m., the STV, 6 hours after Nora Selwick walked out of that building and did not go back, there are 23. Nobody has explained the 23rd pew. Nobody has been able to. It is there, in the photograph, in the row, in the right position, the same oak and the same iron as the rest, bolted to the floor, in holes that look as old as any of the others. And in the 23rd pew, there is a hymnal, open, face down, the way you leave a book when you intend to come back. Before I go on, if this is the kind of case you would want 10 of, and not 1, there is a collection. It is called What the Congregation Left Behind. 10 files, 10 churches, 4 states, 1878 to 1992, every one of them a building that kept going after the people in it stopped, and every one of them a place where somebody found something in the pews that should not have been there. 9 hours, start to finish, to sit with in the dark. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. And before I go on, tell me where you are watching this from tonight. Put it in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches into the dark. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. It is free, and it means the next one finds you. Now then, Coulter, Missouri. Harshaw County, a town that is not on the state highway map and has not been since 1963, when the State Department of Transportation redrew the grid and decided that a gravel road serving 41 people was not worth the ink. The road to Coulter leaves Goshen heading southwest on County Road 12. The pavement ends after 3 miles. The road narrows, the trees close in, and then you are in the hollow. It is not a town in any way that would satisfy a census taker. It is a church and a cemetery, and a general store that has been closed since 1988, and 11 houses spread along a mile and a half of gravel road, and a post office that operates out of a woman's kitchen on Tuesdays and Thursdays. In 1997, it had 37 residents. In 2024, it has 19. The church is at the east end, where the road comes in. You come around the last bend and through a stand of red cedar, and there it is, sitting on a little rise about 30 feet above the creek, facing south with the cemetery on 3 sides of it and the ridge behind it to the north. It is a plain building, white clapboard over a timber frame, with a stone foundation of local limestone that goes down 4 feet to bedrock and in some places deeper. It has a gable roof with cedar shingles, replaced 3 times. It has a bell tower that never held a bell. It has 6 windows on each side, tall and narrow, with glass that was brought in by wagon from Springfield in the summer of 1878. And 5 of those 12 windows still have the original glass, and you can tell which ones they are because the old glass has a faint green tint and a ripple in it that makes the trees outside look like they are underwater. The front door is white oak, 4 inches thick, hung on hand-forged strap hinges, and it has been the same door since 1878. The lock hasp on the outside was installed in 1905 by a man named Grover Jessamine, after an event I am going to describe to you in some detail, and it has held a padlock every night since. Churches face east. That is the tradition. The congregation faces east, toward Jerusalem, toward the rising sun, toward the resurrection. It is not a law. It is not a building code. But in the Ozarks in 1878, it was as close to universal as a tradition gets, and every other church in Harshaw County faces east, and every other church in the 4 counties bordering it faces east, and if you drive 100 miles in any direction from Coulter, you will not find a single church built before 1900 that faces due south. Coulter Methodist Church faces south, and when Nora Selwick asked why, in the first week she was there, 3 different people gave her 3 different answers, and only one of them was willing to say it with the church in sight. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me give you the woman first, Nora Selwick, 34 years old in the fall of 1997. Born on the 8th of June, 1963, in Waynesville, Missouri, which is about 140 miles northeast of Coulter as the crow flies, and about 1,000 miles away in every other way. Her father, Gary Selwick, managed the Western Auto in Waynesville from 1969 to 1988, and then retired to a recliner and never got back up. Her mother, June Selwick, taught 3rd grade at Waynesville Elementary for 22 years, and was the kind of teacher that grown men still talked about at the Piggly Wiggly when they were 40. Nora was the younger of 2. Her brother Calvin was 3 years older and had moved to Kansas City in 1984, and sold insurance, and called on Sundays, and came home for Christmas, and was, in every respect, a perfectly fine brother who had never once been inside a story like this one, and never would be. Nora went to Southwest Missouri State in Springfield, and took a degree in history in 1985, and then a master's in historic preservation at the University of Georgia in 1988, and then came back to Missouri and spent the next 9 years doing the kind of work that historic preservation people do, which is to say she went to old buildings and measured them and photographed them and wrote reports about them that were read by committees and filed in drawers, and she was good at it, and she loved it, and she was, by 1997, one of about 11 people in the state of Missouri who could walk into a 19th century building and tell you what year the foundation was laid, what year the roof was replaced, whether the windows were original, and whether the whole thing was going to fall down. She was not a ghost hunter. She was not a folklorist. She was not the kind of person who believed in anything she could not measure with a tape and a level. I want to be clear about that because of where she ends up. She was also, in the fall of 1997, 3 years past the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and she was not over it, and she was not going to be over it, and she knew that about herself with a clarity that was, in its own way, the most impressive thing about her. June Selwick died on the 11th of March, 1994, of pancreatic cancer, at 58 years old, in a hospital room in Springfield, Missouri, with her daughter holding her hand, and her son stuck in traffic on I-44, and her husband asleep in a chair because he had been awake for 3 days, and his body had simply stopped asking him. June Selwick was 58 years old, and she had taught 3rd grade for 22 years, and she sang in the church choir at First Methodist in Waynesville every Sunday for 31 years, and she could not carry a tune. Could not. Flat, sharp, wandering, sometimes all 3 in one bar, and loud with it, because June Selwick had never in her life done anything quietly that could be done loud. The choir director, a patient man named Wendell Haas, tried to move her to the back row in 1976. She did not go. She stayed in the 2nd row, front left, for 31 years, singing flat and loud and wrong, and Wendell Haas made his peace with it the way a river makes its peace with a rock, and after she died, in the spring of 1994, the choir sounded better and everybody hated it. June could identify any hymn in the Methodist hymnal by the first 2 notes. She had a game she played with Nora when Nora was small. She would hum 2 notes, just 2, and Nora had to name the hymn, and Nora got good at it. And by the time she was 12, she could beat her mother about half the time, and those are the sounds that Nora Selwick carried in her body the way other people carry blood. 2 notes, just 2. June had a habit, when she was concentrating, of pressing the thumbnail of her right hand into the pad of her right index finger. Not picking at it, not biting, just pressing, slowly, hard enough to leave a white crescent, and holding it there while she read or graded papers or figured a grocery list, and releasing it and pressing again. It was a rhythm. Nora used to watch her do it at the kitchen table and tried to count the intervals and decided they were about 4 seconds apart. Press, hold, release, press. June hated the smell of camphor, a deep, unreasoning hatred that predated any memory she could attach it to. Mothballs sent her out of a room. She had a winter coat she would not wear because it had been stored in camphor once, in 1970, and she said she could still smell it in 1993. And June Selwick, in the last 11 days of her life, when the morphine was doing most of the talking, and June was only visiting her own body for a few hours at a time, said one thing to her daughter, that Nora has never repeated to any living person and that I know about, only because it was in a file that Nora Selwick did not know would be opened. I am going to tell you what it was, but not yet, because it does not mean anything yet, and I want it to mean everything when I say it. Those 4 things: the singing flat and loud, the 2-note game, the thumbnail pressing, the camphor. Keep them. The thing in Coulter knew 3 of them, and missed the 4th. And the one it missed is the reason Nora Selwick walked out of that church alive. Now, how she came to be there? In August of 1997, the Ozark's Heritage Foundation, which is a small nonprofit based in Springfield that gives grants for the preservation of historic structures in rural Missouri and Arkansas, received a letter. It was handwritten on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook in the careful block printing of a person who does not write many letters and wants this one to be legible. It was postmarked Goshen, Missouri, and it said this. I am not going to paraphrase it. I have seen a photocopy of it, and I am going to read you the whole thing, because the voice in it matters. Dear Sir or Madam, I am writing about a church building in Coulter, Missouri, in Harshaw County. It is the Coulter Methodist Church. It was built in 1878, and it is still standing and still used for services on Sundays. The roof needs repair badly, and some of the foundation stones have shifted. There is nobody here who can fix it right. We have 37 people in this community, and most of us are old. We were told your foundation gives money for old churches. We would be grateful for any help you can give. The church is important to this community, and we would like it to stand. Signed, Dorothea Pruitt Jessamine, Coulter, Missouri. 11 lines, 37 people, and most of us are old. The foundation sent assessors to evaluate buildings before committing funds. Their usual man was unavailable, so they contacted Nora, who had done 3 prior assessments, and asked her to take a look. Nora said yes. The fee was $350 plus mileage, and she was between jobs, and she was between a lot of other things too, and a drive to the deep Ozarks in October to look at an old church was the kind of thing that had always steadied her. Nora said she would go down the first week of October. She left Springfield on Monday morning, the 6th of October, 1997, at about 7 o'clock, in a 1991 Honda Civic with 141,000 miles on it, with her camera bag, her measuring tools, a clipboard, a sleeping bag, and a cooler with a sandwich and 2 apples and a bottle of water in it. She drove south on Highway 65 and then west on a series of state and county roads that got narrower and rougher as the morning went on, and she crossed into Harshaw County at about 9:30, and she was in Goshen by 10. Goshen looked exactly like what it was. A courthouse square with an elm tree in each corner, and a war memorial with 7 names on it. A feed store with a loading dock, a diner called Maxine's with a screen door and a ceiling fan, a library in a repurposed jail, with bars still on the 2nd floor windows, which either said something about the town's attitude toward history or toward reading, and she was not sure which. She stopped at the diner for coffee because she wanted to ask about the road. That is how she met Dale Elkins, though she did not know his name yet and would not know it for another 20 minutes. He was sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee and a piece of toast, and he was the only person in the place besides Maxine herself, who was a woman of about 70 with a voice like a gravel road and a pot of coffee that she seemed to consider a kind of weapon. Nora sat down 2 stools away and ordered coffee, and asked Maxine if County Road 12 was passable all the way to Coulter. And Maxine set the coffee down and looked at her and said, "It depends on what you mean by passable." And the man at the counter, without turning around, said, "And on what you mean by all the way." His name was Dale Elkins. He was 63 years old. He had been born in Coulter, Missouri in 1934, in the back room of the general store, and he had lived his whole life within 9 miles of that back room, and he knew every rock and rut on County Road 12 the way he knew his own knuckles. A small man, thin, with a face that had been weathered by 63 years of Ozark sun and wind into something that looked like it had been carved out of the same dolomite that the ridge was made of. A cap that said MFA Oil sat on his head, and he had a truck outside that was older than the cap. He asked her what she wanted in Coulter, and she told him, and he nodded, and he said he was headed that way, and she could follow him if she wanted, because the road was not marked past the ford, and there was a fork at mile 9 that sent people wrong about half the time. She followed him. She followed his truck for 14 miles, and the last 7 of those miles were the kind of road that makes you understand why the state took it off the map, and at the ford she watched Dale Elkins drive through 18 inches of water without slowing down, and she followed him through it at about 3 miles an hour, with the water lapping at her door sills. They did not speak again, until they had come over Flint Ridge and dropped into the hollow, and he had pulled over at the wide spot where County Road 12 becomes, for all practical purposes, the main street of Coulter. He got out, and she got out, and they stood in the gravel, and he pointed up the road and said, "Church is that way about a 1/4 mile. You can see the steeple from here." She could. A white point above the cedars. And then Dale Elkins took his cap off, which he had not done, and turned it in his hands, and said 3 things. He said them the way a man says things he has said before and does not want to say again. He said them looking at the ground, not at her, and she told me that the quality of his voice changed when he said them the way a man's voice changes when he is reciting something from memory rather than speaking from his own head. He said, "First thing, do not go into the church after dark. I do not care if you left your camera in there. I do not care if you left your car keys in there. If the sun is down and the door is locked, you do not go in. The lock is there for a reason, and the reason is not your business," he said. "Second thing, if you are in the church during the day and you hear singing, and there is nobody in the building with you, you walk out. You do not stop to listen. You do not try to figure out what it is. You walk out, and you close the door behind you, and you do not go back in until the next morning." And he said, "Third thing, there are 22 pews in that church. When you go in, you count them, every time. You count them out loud, starting at the back left and going forward, and then starting at the back right and going forward. 22. And if you count them and you get 23, you leave." Then he put his cap back on and said, "That is all I am going to say about it, and I will not say it again." And he got in his truck and drove away, and he did not look back. And Nora Selwick stood in the gravel in the October sunshine and thought, well, there it is. They have a story about the church, and everybody who comes here gets told it. She was right about that. It is the only thing she was right about that whole first day. She was also thinking about something else, something she could not quite put a finger on, and it took her until about 2 in the afternoon to figure out what it was. It was Dale Elkins's truck. He had driven her in. He had driven 14 miles on a rough road to lead a stranger to Coulter, and then he had given her the warnings, and then he had driven away. He had not turned around. The wide spot where they had stopped had plenty of room to turn a truck. The road went on another 1/4 mile past the church and dead-ended at a gate. There was nowhere to go but back, and Dale Elkins had not turned around. He had driven on, past the church, toward the dead end, and she had heard his truck for another minute or so, and then she had not heard it, and she assumed he had turned somewhere she did not know about. He had not. There is nowhere to turn. She found that out later. The road dead ends at a steel gate on a post and wire fence, and there is a wide spot there too, barely, enough to turn a truck if you do a 3-point turn, which is to say, Dale Elkins drove a 1/4 mile past the church and turned around in a space the size of a kitchen, and drove back past the church and past her and back out the 14 miles to Goshen rather than turn around in the wide spot in front of the church. He never turned his truck around in sight of that building. She asked about it later, and the answer she got was the answer everybody got, which was no answer at all. The church grounds. Let me put you there because you are going to need to see it for the rest of this. You come up the gravel road, and the cedars open up, and there is a clearing of about 1.5 acres, slightly elevated on the north side where the church sits, sloping down to Stillwell Branch on the south. The church is centered in the clearing with the cemetery on 3 sides, east, west, and north, the oldest stones to the east and the newest to the west. The gravel road runs along the south edge. There is a small gravel parking area that holds maybe 8 cars, though Nora doubted it had ever held 8 cars at one time. The cemetery has 141 stones. She counted them later, during the assessment, Because counting things is what she did. 141 stones. The oldest dated 1847. The newest dated 1993. And I want to flag the oldest one right now, because you caught it, and you are right, and it matters. 1847. The church was built in 1878. There are 31 graves in that cemetery that predate the church by anywhere from 1 to 31 years. People were being buried on that ground before the church was built. That is not, by itself, unusual. Rural cemeteries often predate the churches built near them, but the arrangement is unusual, and Nora noticed it on the first day, and it took her another week to understand what she was seeing. The stones from 1847 through 1877 are arranged in a rough oval, not rows. An oval, about 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, on the north side of the church. And the church is not just near the oval, the church is inside it. The north wall of the church, the back wall, cuts through the oval at about the 2/3 mark. If you drew the oval on a map as a complete shape, the church would be sitting on the southern third of it, as though the church had been placed deliberately into the open end of a ring of graves, or as though the ring of graves had been placed around something that was already there, and then the church had been built on top of it. I will come back to that. Nora came back to it too, on the 9th day, when she was in the part of the foundation she should not have been in, and what she found there made her sit down in the dirt and stay there for a long time. She parked her car in the gravel lot and got her camera and her clipboard and walked up to the church and stood in front of it and did the thing she always did, which was to stand there for 2 or 3 minutes and just look. She said that was the most important part of the job. Before you measure anything, before you photograph anything, you stand there and you let the building tell you what it is. What she saw was a plain white clapboard church, well maintained for its age, with a roof that needed work, sitting on a rise in a pretty hollow in the deep Ozarks on a blue sky October afternoon. She saw the bell tower with no bell. 6 windows showed on each side. She saw the front door, white oak, with the strap hinges and the hasp and the padlock hanging open on its ring. 5 limestone steps led to the door. She put her hand on the door, and she pushed it open and went in. And the first thing she noticed was the cold. It was the 6th of October. It was 68 degrees outside, sunny, calm, the kind of October day in the Ozarks when the light comes in gold through the trees and the air smells like drying leaves. And the inside of Coulter Methodist Church was cold. Not cool the way a stone building is cool. Cold. She said later that she could see her breath, and then she looked more carefully and decided she could not, but that she had expected to be able to, which is a strange thing to say and a true one. It was the kind of cold that sits in a room like an opinion. She stood in the vestibule and let her eyes adjust. The vestibule was small, about 6 feet deep, with a coat rack on each side, the kind made of iron with hooks shaped like fingers, and a rubber mat on the floor that said "Welcome," and a table with a stack of bulletins from the previous Sunday, and a vase with plastic flowers in it that had faded to a color that was not quite any color. Ahead of her, through an arch, the sanctuary. I want to describe this room carefully, because you are going to be in it for a long time. 36 feet wide, 52 feet long, 14 feet to the peak, white plaster walls, oak floor, 6 windows on each side. The 5 originals had green-tinted rippled glass that threw a different light, a light that moved when you moved. 22 oak pews, 11 on each side, bolted to the floor. At the front, 3 steps to the chancel, with a walnut altar, a lectern, and a wooden cross. There was no organ. There was no piano. Nora noticed that and filed it. A Methodist church built in 1878, in a community that had been established long enough to have a cemetery going back to 1847, and there was no instrument. She stood in the center aisle and breathed the cold air and thought about Dale Elkins telling her to count the pews. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the church. The exterior dimensions came first. All 4 elevations got photographed. She went up a ladder she found in the cemetery shed and looked at the roof, which was, as the letter had said, in bad shape. The foundation inspection came next, walking the perimeter, noting 3 places where the limestone blocks had shifted, and 1 place on the northeast corner where the mortar had failed, and you could see daylight through a gap about 2 inches wide. Through that gap she could see a crawl space of about 3 feet between the ground and the floor joists, dark with a dirt floor, and she noted on her clipboard that she would need to get under the building the next day to assess the foundation from the inside. She did not go under the building the next day. She went under it on the 9th day, and by then she was looking for something specific, and she found it, and I think she wished she had not. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, the light began to change, the way light changes in a deep hollow in October, not gradually, but in a step, like somebody turning a dimmer, and she heard a truck on the gravel, and looked out the front door, and saw a man coming up the road. His name was Harlan Jessamine. He was 71 years old. He was the great-nephew of the Grover Jessamine, who had installed the lock hasp in 1905, and the grandson of the Dorothea Pruitt Jessamine, who had written the letter to the foundation, and he was the man who locked the church every night, and had been since he was 19 years old. He walked up the steps and stopped when he saw her in the vestibule, and looked at her for a second, and then said, "You would be the one from Springfield?" She said she was. He said, "Well, you have got about 20 minutes of light." She said she was just finishing up for the day. He nodded. He did not come in. He stood on the top step and waited, and after a moment she understood that he was waiting for her to leave so he could lock the door, and that he was not going to come inside while she was in there, and that this was not rudeness. This was a man who had a job to do, and a time to do it, and the time was now. She gathered her things and came out, and he stepped to the side to let her pass, and then, without a word, he pulled the door shut and threaded the padlock through the hasp, and clicked it closed, and tested it with a pull. Then he went around the east side of the building, and she heard a second lock, and then the west side, and she heard a third. And he came back around the front and stood there for a moment, looking at the door, the way you look at a thing you have looked at 10,000 times and will look at 10,000 more. She said, "Mr. Jessamine, can I ask you something?" He said, "You can ask." She said, "Why do you lock it from the outside?" And Harlan Jessamine looked at her with his fence-post face and said, "Because it does not work from the inside." And she waited for him to explain that, and he did not explain it, and he walked down the steps and got in his truck and drove away, and he backed out. He backed the truck all the way out of the clearing, the way Dale Elkins had. The way, she would learn, everybody in Coulter backed out of that clearing, rather than turn around in sight of the church. She stood in the gravel, and the light went, and the hollow filled up with shadow from the bottom, like a bowl filling with water, and the church went from white to gray, and then to a color that was not gray, and not blue, and not quite any color, and she was alone with it. And she noticed the thing that everybody who has ever stood in that clearing at dusk has noticed, and that not one of them has been able to make anybody else understand. The silence had an edge to it. It was not the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a place that was paying attention. October in the Ozarks is loud at night, the same as everywhere in the eastern woodlands in autumn. Crickets, tree frogs, a barred owl on every ridge calling "Who cooks for you?" and getting an answer from the next ridge over. The whole night is a wall of sound, and it starts before full dark and does not stop until dawn. She stood in the clearing at Coulter and heard nothing. Below her, down at the creek, she could hear it. The whole racket, going on the way it should, 100 yards away and lower. Frogs, crickets, something splashing. Life doing what life does in October. And it stopped at the clearing. Not faded. Stopped. She took a step toward the south edge, and the sound came up. A step back, and it dropped. She did that 3 times. And the third time she did it, she felt foolish. And the fourth time she did it, she felt something else. And she went to her car and drove back down the road toward the wide spot where Dorothea Jessamine had told her she could park for the night. The plan had been to sleep in her car. She had done it before on assessments, in small towns where there was no motel, and it had never bothered her. The sleeping bag and pillow and flashlight and book were in the back seat. And the back seat of the Civic was not comfortable, but it was flat enough. She did not sleep. She lay in the back seat and listened to nothing at all, and looked at the trees against the sky, which still had a little light in them, and she thought about the cold in the church, and the silence in the clearing, and the man who locked the doors, and she told herself the thing that people in her profession tell themselves about old buildings in small towns. Every old building has a story. The story is never supernatural. The story is always about people. Superstition is a form of architecture. It is how people build around the things they cannot explain, and the building is always more interesting than the thing they think is inside it. She had written that in a paper in graduate school, and she still believed it, and she fell asleep believing it at about 11:30. She woke at 3 in the morning because of the singing. It was faint. It was far away, or it sounded far away, which is not the same thing. It was coming from the direction of the church, a quarter-mile up the road, through the cedars, and it was a hymn, and she knew which hymn it was from the first 2 notes. It was, "Come, thou fount of every blessing." Second tune. The 1 in 3 to 4 time. She knew it because her mother had sung it, flat and loud and wrong, every Sunday for 31 years, and because it was the hymn they sang at her mother's funeral, in tune, which was worse. She lay in the back seat of her car in the dark and listened to a hymn coming out of a locked church at 3 in the morning, and the singing was not good. It was not a choir. It was not a recording. It was one voice, and it was flat, and it was loud, and it did not carry a tune. And Nora Selwick did the thing that you and I both know we would do, which is the wrong thing, which is the human thing. She got out of the car. She got out and stood in the road in her socks, and the singing was clearer. And it was definitely coming from the church, and it was definitely one voice, and the voice was a woman's, and the woman could not sing. She stood there for about 4 minutes. She timed it later by her watch, which she had looked at when she woke, and looked at again when she got back in the car. 4 minutes. And in those 4 minutes, the singing went through the first verse, and the second verse, and into the third. And it was word perfect, and it was the right tune, and it was flat, in exactly the way her mother had been flat, a quarter tone under on every high note. And Nora Selwick stood in the road in the dark in her socks, with tears running down her face and her hands shaking. And she did not walk toward it, and she did not walk away from it. And at the end of the third verse, the singing stopped. It did not fade. It stopped. The way a voice stops when the mouth closes. And, in the silence after it, in the 3 or 4 seconds before the frogs and the crickets came back, she heard something else from the direction of the church. A click. A small, dry click. The sound of something being pressed against something else. A 4-second pause. Another click. The sound of a thumbnail pressing into the pad of an index finger and releasing and pressing again. She got in the car and locked the doors and sat in the front seat with the engine running and the headlights on and did not move until the sun came up. At 6:45 in the morning, in full daylight, she drove up to the church and parked and got out and walked up to the front door. The padlock was in place. She walked around to the side door. Locked. The root cellar, locked. She walked the full perimeter of the building, and every window was closed and latched from the inside, and there was no way in and no way out. She stood at the front door and put her ear to the oak and listened. Cold air was coming through the crack between the door and the frame. Not a draft, a breath, slow, rhythmic, as though the building itself were sleeping. She went back to her car and sat in it for 30 minutes, and then she went to find Dorothea Jessamine. Dorothea Pruitt Jessamine was 89 years old. She lived in a frame house 200 yards from the general store, a house she had lived in since her marriage in 1927, and she had been born in Coulter and would die in Coulter, and had spent exactly 4 nights of her life outside of Harshaw County, all of them in Springfield, all of them for medical reasons she described as a nuisance. A small bent woman with white hair pulled back in a knot, and hands that looked like bundles of sticks wrapped in paper, and she was the sharpest person Nora Selwick had met in a year, and Nora knew it inside of 1 minute. Opaline was on her front porch when Nora pulled up, in a wooden chair with a pillow on it, with a cup of coffee and a quilt over her knees. She looked at Nora. "The way you look at a letter you have been expecting," she said. "You heard it." Nora said yes, and Dorothea Jessamine said, "Well, come sit down, and I will tell you what I know, but first I want you to know that what I know is not all of it, and that nobody alive knows all of it, and that the last person who knew all of it is in that cemetery. And she has been there since 1947, and she was my grandmother, and she did not tell me everything because she said there were some things you could know, and some things that knowing was a trespass on, and she told me which was which, and I have kept to it." Nora sat down. Dorothea looked at the church. From her porch you could see the steeple above the trees, white against the blue, and she looked at it the way you look at something you have been looking at for 89 years and still have not made up your mind about. And then she started talking. She said that the ground the church sits on was not empty when the church was built. She said that the cemetery started in 1847, which is when the first settlers came into the hollow, but that the ground had been used before that by people who did not leave any markers that the settlers recognized as markers. She said her grandmother, a woman named Parthenia Call, told her that the first settlers found a ring of stones on the flat ground above the creek, sunk into the earth, spaced about 6 feet apart, forming an oval about 60 feet long and 40 feet wide. The stones were limestone, local, uncut but chosen for flatness, each about the size of a man's chest, and they were sunk into the ground so that only the top 2 or 3 inches showed, and they had been there long enough that the roots of the trees had grown around them and the soil had built up level with their tops so that you could walk across the ring and not notice the stones unless you were looking for them or unless you tripped on one. The settlers did not know what the ring was. They assumed it was old. They assumed it was Indian. They did not disturb it. They started burying their dead inside the ring. Dorothea said that plainly, without emphasis. The way you say a thing you have said before and that you know sounds worse to other people than it does to you. They buried inside the ring, not because of any belief about the ring, because it was flat ground, cleared of trees, and the soil was soft, and it was a sensible place to put a cemetery, and the stones made a natural boundary. 31 graves in 31 years, 1847 to 1877. And then, in 1878, the community built a church, and they built it inside the ring. Not next to the ring, not across the road from the ring. Inside it, on the south half, so that the back wall of the church sat inside the oval of graves, and the foundation of the church sat on whatever the ring had been built around. Dorothea said her grandmother told her that the decision to build on that spot was not unanimous. She said there were 3 families who did not want the church there. She said they did not say why, not in plain words, not in any words that survived, but that they had made it known, and they had been overruled, and 2 of those 3 families left the hollow within a year of the church being built. The 3rd family stayed. Their name was Call, Parthenia's people, and the reason they stayed, Dorothea said, is because somebody had to watch it. She did not explain what she meant by that. Not in those words, not at that point in the morning. She said it and she let it sit, and she took a drink of her coffee. Then she said the sentence that Nora Selwick wrote down that night in a motel room in Goshen on the back of a gas station receipt, in a hand that shook. Some churches pray upward, Dorothea said, and some churches pray downward, and the ones that pray downward have been doing it so long they do not know the difference anymore. The words are the same, the hymns are the same, but the ground underneath them is listening to a different ear. Nora asked her what was under the church, and Dorothea Jessamine said, "I do not know what it is. My grandmother did not know what it was. The Osage did not have a word for it, and neither do I. What I know is this: it is old. It is in the stone, and it has learned every word that has ever been said in that building, and every name that has ever been called in that building, and every hymn that has ever been sung in that building, and at night, when nobody is there, it practices. It practices." Nora sat on that porch in the October sunshine and felt the words sit in her stomach like a stone. And she asked the question that any rational person would ask, which is, if that is true, why does anyone still use the building? Why not tear it down? Why not stop holding services? Why not walk away? And Dorothea looked at her with a patience that was older than patience and said, "Because we tried that in 1914. After what happened to Reverend Askew, we stopped services for 3 months. We locked the doors. We left it alone. And in those 3 months is when it got worse. In those 3 months, it went from practicing in the dark to practicing for something. It learned faster. It got louder. A man walking past at 2 in the morning heard a full congregation in there, singing 4-part harmony, the way no congregation in Coulter had ever sung. A woman found footprints on the steps in the morning frost. A child's shoe was found on the altar. They opened the door after 3 months, and the pews had been moved. Not far, an inch or two, toward the altar, all of them, as though they had been scooting forward, a little at a time, for 90 days. She said, "We learned that you cannot leave it alone. If you leave it alone, it finishes learning, and we do not know what it does when it has finished learning. My grandmother said that the old people, the call people, had a word for what it was doing. They called it rehearsing, and they said that what it was rehearsing for was a service, its own service, not ours, and that if it ever held its own service, if it ever got all the way through from the first hymn to the last prayer, with no one in the building to interrupt it, then the ground under the church would do what the ground wanted to do, which is open," she said. "So we go in every Sunday, and we interrupt it. We have been interrupting it for 119 years. That is what the services are. They are not for us. They are interruptions." Nora Selwick sat on that porch and listened to an 89-year-old woman tell her that a community of 37 people had been holding church services for 119 years, not for worship, containment, and she felt the floor of her professional judgment tilt a few degrees, and she did not say anything for a while. Then she asked about the lock. Why the lock, if the church needed to be used? And Dorothea said, "Because at night it is not ours. At night it belongs to whatever is underneath. The lock is not to keep it in, because you cannot keep it in. The lock is to keep us out. The lock is so that nobody walks in there at 3 in the morning because they heard their mother singing and opens a door they cannot close." Nora flinched at that, and Dorothea saw it. And Dorothea said, very quietly, "It uses what it has learned. That is the only thing it does. It has heard 119 years of voices. It has heard every name spoken in that room. It has heard every prayer, and every hymn, and every whisper, and every mother calling a child to stop fidgeting. And at night, it plays them back. And it does not play them back the way a recording does. It plays them back the way a student does. Getting better," she said. The first 10 years it could barely manage a note. My grandmother said it sounded like wind in a chimney. By the turn of the century, it had hymns. By the 20s, it had voices, individual voices. By the 50s, it could do a whole verse, in a specific person's voice, word perfect. And then she said, "And here is the part where Nora's hands went cold on a warm October morning," she said, "and it is still getting better. Every year it gets a little better, a little closer to right. And the day it gets all the way right, the day it can do a whole service from beginning to end with no one able to tell the difference, is the day we are in trouble. Because on that day it will not need us any more." Nora asked, "What happens on that day?" And Dorothea Jessamine said, "I do not know. My grandmother did not know. But she said the old people called it the last Sunday, and she said that when the last Sunday comes, you do not want to be in that hollow." Now I need to slow down, because the next part of this story is the part that nobody outside of Coulter has ever heard, and it is the part that makes everything else make sense, and I cannot rush it. I have to give you the history of that church, the way Dorothea gave it to Nora, and the way Nora checked it against the records she found in the county courthouse in Goshen over the next 10 days, and the way both of them, the old woman's telling and the county paper, agree on every point except two, and the 2 points where they disagree are worse than either version by itself. The hollow that Coulter sits in was first settled in 1844 by 3 families who came down from the Lead Belt region to the northeast. Their names were Call, Pruitt, and Jessamine. There may have been a 4th family, named Alt or Alt something, who came the same year and left within 6 months, but the evidence for them is thin, and I am not going to build on it. The Calls took the east end of the hollow, nearest the mouth. The Pruitts took the middle. The Jessamines took the west end, farthest from the road, deepest in, where the ridge closes in on both sides and the creek narrows. They found the ring of stones within the first month. Dorothea said that Parthenia Call's account, which came to Parthenia from her own grandmother, who was there, was that the men walked the ring and discussed it, and that the senior Call, a man named Hosea, said it was Indian work and to leave it be. There was no argument about that. They left it. They started burying inside it in 1847, when a child named Elspeth Pruitt died of a fever at 2 years old. She was the first grave. Her stone is still there. It says, "Elspeth, daughter of James and Cora Pruitt, born March 4, 1845, died September 19, 1847, safe in the arms." And it is the easternmost grave in the oval, close to the ring of stones, and the stone is small and has sunk into the ground so that only the top 3 inches show, and Nora Selwick found it on the second day and brushed the moss off it and read it and sat there for a minute. Between 1847 and 1877, 31 people were buried inside the ring. The population of the hollow grew slowly. By 1870, the 3 original families had been joined by 4 more, and by 1875, there were, by one estimate, about 90 people living on Stillwell Branch between the mouth of the hollow and the dead end. 90 people, 3 decades. And in those 3 decades, by Dorothea's account and by the county record, there were no reports, no stories, no incidents, no whispers about anything unusual on that ground. 31 years of ordinary settlement in an ordinary Ozark hollow. People were born and died and were buried inside the ring, and nothing happened. Then they built the church. The decision to build was made at a meeting in the Pruitt House in February of 1878. There were, by the single surviving account, 11 men present. The question was, where? There were 2 proposals. The first was to build on the flat ground above the creek, inside the ring, which had the advantages of being level, central, and already cleared. The second was to build on a piece of ground about a quarter-mile west, on the Jessamine property, which was also flat, but required clearing, and was farther from the road. 3 men voted for the Jessamine site. They were Hosea Call's grandson Merritt, a Pruitt whose first name is not recorded, and a man named Abel Jessamine. The other 8 voted for the ring. Abel Jessamine, Dorothea said, stood up after the vote and said one sentence. He said, "You are building a church on a mouth." Nobody asked him what he meant, or if they did, it was not written down. The meeting ended. The 8 went ahead. The church was raised in the summer of 1878 by community labor on a foundation of local limestone that was laid by a man brought in from Ava, Missouri, who was paid $22 for 2 weeks of work and who left on the 15th day and, according to one source, did not take the road home but went north over the ridge and came out in Douglas County rather than drive back through the hollow. The stonemason's name was Clement Race. I looked for more on him and found nothing. $22, 2 weeks, and gone over the ridge. That is all there is. The first service was held on the 3rd Sunday of September, 1878, with a circuit preacher named Larkin Sims, who served 4 churches in 3 counties and came through Coulter once a month when the road was passable and not at all when it was not. There were, by the entry in the ledger that Larkin Sims kept, 43 people in attendance. He noted the hymns, which were Amazing Grace and Rock of Ages, and he noted the text, which was Romans 8, verse 28. And all things work together for good. And he noted one other thing. At the bottom of the entry, in a smaller hand, as though he had come back to it later, and added it, he wrote, "Unusual acoustic in the building. Singing seems to continue a half-second after the congregation stops, as though the room itself is holding the last note. Pleasant effect." Mentioned it to the people, and they had not noticed. A half-second. In 1878. That is the first record, the first written record, of the church doing what it does. And the man who noticed it called it pleasant. I want to sit on that word, because it is the cruelest thing in this whole file. Pleasant. A room that holds the last note of a hymn for half a second longer than it should. A warm little echo. A bit of charm. That is how it starts. That is how all of them start. 60 years later, the room was holding whole hymns. 90 years later, it was holding voices. 119 years later, it was singing by itself at 3 in the morning, in a voice that sounded like a dead woman's mother. And the man who first heard it called it pleasant. Now, the 14 ministers, between 1878 and 1997, 14 ordained ministers served Coulter Methodist Church. I am not going to go through all 14, but I am going to go through the ones that matter, because the pattern they make is the pattern of the thing learning, and if you see the pattern, you will understand what Nora Selwick walked into. The first 5 served between 1878 and 1900, and they were all circuit preachers who came through once a month and did not live in the hollow. None of them reported anything beyond the acoustic. One of them, a man named Fowler, noted in 1885 that the church was unusually cold on a warm day, and that the candles on the altar had a tendency to gutter toward the front of the building, as though there were a draft coming up through the floor. He wrote, "There is good air circulation from below, which will be of benefit in summer." Good air circulation from below. That is the second record, and again, the man who noticed it put a harmless frame on it and moved on. The 6th minister is the first one who matters. His name was Cedric Colquitt, and he was the first full-time minister Coulter had ever had. He came in 1902, which is 24 years after the church was built, and he was 26 years old, and he was fresh out of a seminary in Nashville, and he had a wife named Pearl, and a daughter named Frances, who was 3. And he lasted 3 years, from 1902 to 1905, and what happened to him in those 3 years is the reason the lock went on the door. I do not have Cedric's own account. What I have is a letter by his wife, Pearl, 12 pages long, in the Historical Society collection. She writes that the first 6 months were fine. Then, in March of 1903, Pearl was alone in the church and heard a voice say a name. She told Cedric. He said it was the acoustic. The voice came back. In October, Cedric heard it himself, his full name. And then other names, as though the voice were working through a list. I am going to give you the important parts. I was eager to believe him. That is a sentence that tells you everything about the next 2 years. And then, in October of 1903, Cedric heard it himself. Pearl does not describe Cedric's reaction in detail. She writes only this. He came home on a Tuesday evening in October, and he was white in the face, and he sat down at the table, and he said, "Pearl, it said my name." She asked him what he meant, and he said he had been in the church alone, preparing the Sunday sermon at the lectern, and a voice from the back of the room, from the last pew, had said clearly, "Cedric Colquitt," his full name, first and last, the way you call a name from a roll. And then, he said, there was a pause. And then the voice said, another name, a name he did not know, and another, as though the voice were working through a list, and his name had simply come up in sequence. He went to the back of the room, and there was no one. He checked the vestibule, the cemetery, the grounds, no one. He did what any young minister with a seminary degree and a family to feed and nowhere else to go would do. He told himself it was the wind, or the building settling, or his own imagination, he told Pearl, and he went back to work. November of 1903, a Sunday service. The congregation that day was, by Pearl's estimate, about 30 people. Cedric was at the lectern, midway through the sermon, and every person in the room heard a voice, from somewhere above them, from the ceiling, or from the bell tower, or from the air itself, join the last line of the hymn they had sung 10 minutes before. One line, the last line of "Blessed be the tie that binds," sung in a voice that Pearl describes as close but wrong. She writes, "It sounded like a person who had heard the hymn many times but had never been taught to sing it, the way a parrot will say a word without knowing it is a word. It had the notes, and it had the words, and it did not have the meaning. Nobody moved." Pearl writes that she looked at the woman next to her, a woman named Lottie Jessamine, and Lottie was looking straight ahead with her hands flat on her knees, and Pearl understood, looking at Lottie's face, that Lottie had heard this before. She writes, "I understood then that the people of Coulter knew, that they had always known, that they had brought us here knowing, and that they had not told us because they did not believe telling would help." That last sentence, they did not believe telling would help. I think about that a lot, because it is not unkindness. It is something harder than unkindness. It is a community that has been living with something for 25 years and has made a practical decision about the limits of explanation. The services continued. They continued because, as Dorothea had told Nora 100 years later, stopping was worse. But the voice in the church continued too, and it got worse in the way that Dorothea described, in the way that everything about this case gets worse, which is not through sudden scares, but through slow improvement. The thing was getting better. By December of 1903, it could do whole verses, not just the last line. By January of 1904, it was doing them in what Pearl calls different voices, and she writes that on a Sunday in late January, she heard the voice do the first verse of "Nearer, my God, to Thee," in a woman's voice that she recognized. She did not say whose voice it was in the letter. She says only, "It was the voice of a woman I knew, who had been dead for 2 years." And in February of 1904, something changed. Something that is in Pearl Colquitt's letter, and in the sheriff's report, and in the church meeting minutes, and all three of them describe it differently, and all three of them are clearly describing the same event. In February of 1904, the church began to practice at night, not the half-second echo, not a single line. Full hymns, multiple voices, starting at about 2 or 3 in the morning and going on for 20 or 30 minutes. Audible from the road, from the cemetery, from the parsonage, a quarter-mile away. A full congregation that was not there, singing in voices of the dead. And Cedric began going to the church at night, barefoot, in his nightclothes, across frozen ground. 7 nights. On the 7th night, Pearl found him kneeling at the altar rail. She touched his shoulder, and he said, "She is teaching me the names." Pearl Colquitt's letter becomes hard to read here, because her hand becomes hard to read. She writes that she and Cedric lay in bed in the parsonage and listened to the singing, and did not speak to each other, and did not sleep, and that this went on for 6 weeks. She writes that Cedric began to go to the church at night. She writes that he went 7 nights in a row. On the 7th night, he did not come back. Pearl woke at 5 in the morning, and he was not in the bed, and she dressed and walked to the church in the dark with a lantern, and the front door was open. The padlock was on the ground, not cut, not forced, opened. Opened with the key, which was on a nail in the parsonage kitchen, which was a quarter-mile away, which means either Cedric had taken it or something else had. She went in. "She is teaching me the names." Pearl asked him, "Whose names?" And he said the names of the ones who are underneath. And then he said, "There are 27 of them, 27 underneath and 31 above. And they want the same thing, Pearl. They want to be called." That is the last thing Pearl Colquitt wrote about her husband's words in that letter. She writes that she took him home and put him to bed, and that he slept for 14 hours, and that when he woke up, he did not remember any of it, and that she did not tell him, and that she began packing. They left Coulter on the 8th of April, 1905. Cedric was removed from the pulpit by the district superintendent on grounds of exhaustion and sent to a rest home in Joplin, where he spent 4 months, and where he recovered, and where he never spoke about Coulter again. Pearl and Francis went to Tennessee. They did not come back, and on the 17th of April, 1905, 9 days after the Colquitts left, the church held a meeting. 6 men. The minutes are in the Harshaw County Historical Society box. They are a single page, in a hand I cannot identify. The minutes say this: "Meeting called to address the matter of the church building. Motion made by Grover Jessamine to install locks on all exterior doors, to be locked at dusk and unlocked at dawn. Keys to be held by a single key holder. Motion seconded by Merritt Call. Discussion. No discussion recorded. Passed unanimous." And then, at the bottom, in a different ink, in a hand that is almost certainly Merritt Call's, there is one more line. It says, "Also resolved that services shall continue without interruption, regardless of vacancy of pulpit." Services shall continue without interruption, regardless of vacancy of pulpit. They were going to keep interrupting it, whether they had a minister or not. And they have. For 119 years, every Sunday, a community that has shrunk from 90 to 37 to 19, holding services in a building they are afraid of because the alternative is letting it practice in peace. That is the architecture of this story. That is the frame that everything else hangs on. The church is not haunted. That is the wrong word for it. The church is studying now. The next 8 ministers cover the next 92 years, and I could take you through all of them, but I would be padding, and I told you at the beginning I would not pad. So I am going to give you the 3 that matter and trust you to hold the shape. The 8th minister was Reverend Orlo Askew, 1912 to 14. On the 4th of March, 1914, he held an exorcism at midnight. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the candles went out, and the thing answered him with his own words, his own sermon, played back with one change. Everywhere he had said God, The voice said nothing. A hole in the sentence. The deacons ran. Askew stayed. What he heard in the next hour broke something in him. He was found the next morning on a gravestone, silent. On the fourth day, he said, "It knows all of them, every name ever said in that room, and it is sorting them." On the 4th of March, 1914, Orlo Askew held an exorcism. It was not sanctioned by the Methodist Church. It was not sanctioned by anybody. He did it himself, with a Bible and a bottle of oil and 2 deacons who did not want to be there at midnight in the church, with all the candles lit, and then the candles went out, all of them, at the same instant, not guttered, not blown, out, as though the air in the room had been replaced by something that was not air. And in the dark, from the space under the floor, from the crawl space beneath the foundation, something answered him. It answered him with his own words, his own voice, his own cadence, his own sermon from the Sunday before, played back at him from underneath, word for word, in perfect imitation, with one change. Everywhere Orlo Askew had said God. The voice underneath said nothing. A silence, a hole in the sentence where the word should have been, as though the thing could learn every word in the language except that one, or as though it chose not to say it. He left. The church was shut 3 months. The thing got louder. The pews moved toward the altar. They reopened, and the thing settled back. And Coulter understood it was dealing with a student. If you are still with me this deep into the dark, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from. The link for What the Congregation Left Behind is in the description, and it has 10 more of these, each one longer than the last. Now then, the 11th minister is the next one that matters, and she is the one who left behind the document that Nora Selwick found. Her name was Margaret Voss. She came to Coulter in the fall of 1941. She was 38 years old, and she was the first woman to serve that pulpit, and she lasted longer than any minister before or since, 7 years. 1941 to 1948. And the reason she lasted 7 years is that she was the first minister who understood what she was dealing with and tried to study it rather than fight it. Margaret Voss was not from the Ozarks. She was from St. Louis. She had gone to seminary there, and she had served 2 churches in Illinois before she came south. And she came south for reasons that have nothing to do with this story and everything to do with the fact that in 1941, a woman minister in the Methodist Church had about 4 options for a pulpit, and 3 of them were in places nobody else wanted to go. She arrived in September, and she heard the singing on her 3rd night, and she went to the deacons the next morning and said, "Tell me everything." And they told her, because by 1941, they were tired of not telling, and because she was the sort of woman you told things to. She listened, and she asked questions, and then she did something that no minister before her had done. She started a journal, not a diary, a journal of observations, systematic, dated, measured where she could measure, counted where she could count. She kept it for 7 years, and it is the most extraordinary document in this whole case, and it was found by Nora Selwick on the 8th day of her assessment in a metal box under the floorboards of the parsonage where Margaret Voss had hidden it in 1948 when she left. I am going to tell you about the journal, but first I want to tell you about what happened on Nora Selwick's 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th days in Coulter, because by the time she found the journal she needed it, and I want you to need it the same way. Nora Selwick went back into Coulter Methodist Church on the morning of Tuesday, the 7th of October, 1997, at about 8 o'clock. She had slept in a motel in Goshen the night before, a place called the Sycamore Motor Court that had 12 rooms and a Pepsi machine and a window unit that made a sound like a dog dreaming. She had slept badly. She had lain in the dark and listened to the window unit and thought about Dorothea Jessamine's voice saying it practices, and she had tried to put a professional frame on it, and the frame would not hold, and she fell asleep at about 1 in the morning, and woke at 6, and drove the 14 miles back to Coulter in the early light, with the windows down and the air smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The church was still locked, all 3 doors. She had been given a key by Harlan Jessamine on the first day, a brass key on a piece of twine that was newer than the lock it fit, and she unlocked the front door and went in. The cold was there, the same cold. 62 degrees outside, October morning, sun coming up over the east ridge, and the inside of the church was cold enough that she could feel it on her face and on her hands, the way you feel a cold window. She counted the pews. 22. She counted them in her head, the way she had the day before, and she got 22. She began her interior survey. She had a form she used, a checklist she had developed over 9 years of assessments, and it covered everything from the condition of the plaster to the type of nails to the presence of insect damage in the framing. She started at the front and worked back, measuring, photographing, making notes on the clipboard. It was the kind of work she loved, the slow, careful, hands-on work of reading a building the way you read a book. And for the first hour she was absorbed in it, and the church was just a church, a well-built, well-maintained, 119-year-old church that needed a roof and some foundation work, and that was all. At about 9:15, she was at the back of the room, examining the baseboards along the west wall. She was on her knees with a flashlight, looking at the joint between the baseboard and the floor, checking for water damage. And she heard a sound. It came from the front of the room, from the area near the altar. And it was not a voice, and it was not a hymn, and it was not anything she could have described in a way that would make sense if you were not in that room. It was a breath. One breath. A long, slow inhalation, as though something very large and very patient had breathed in, and the whole room had tightened, the way a room tightens when the barometric pressure drops before a storm, except that the windows were closed and the weather was clear. She turned around. The room was empty. The altar was there, the cross was there, the lectern, the chair. Nothing had moved, nothing was different, but the cold had changed. It had moved. It was no longer evenly distributed across the room. It was concentrated at the front, near the altar, and it was stronger, and it was not the cold of a stone building in the morning, it was the cold of a presence. She stood up, and she did a thing that surprised her. She walked toward it, not because she was brave, though she was, not because she was curious, though she was. She walked toward it because she had spent 9 years reading buildings, and a building that had something to say was a building she wanted to hear. She walked up the center aisle toward the altar. The cold got worse with each step. By the time she was at the front row, she could feel it in her lungs, and her breath was visible, and it was 9:15 in the morning on a 62-degree day. She stood at the altar rail, and she looked at the floor. The floor at the front of the church, on the chancel platform, was different from the floor in the rest of the building. She had noticed it the day before and noted it on her form, and what she had noted was that the floorboards on the chancel were older than the floorboards in the nave, wider, rougher, hand-hewn rather than mill-sawn, and they did not match. The floorboards in the nave were white oak, consistent, with a visible grain, clearly from the same lot of timber. The floorboards on the chancel were a mix, at least 2 species, oak and something else, something darker, with a grain she did not recognize, and when she put her tape on them, the widths were irregular, 8 inches, 10 inches, 12, as though they had been pulled from different sources, and laid down without much concern for appearance. She had noted all of this and thought nothing of it beyond the obvious, which was that the chancel floor had been repaired or replaced at some point with salvaged lumber, which was common in rural churches. But now, kneeling on that floor with the cold pressing on her from all sides, she noticed something she had not noticed the day before. The boards were not nailed down. They were laid down, set in place. Resting on the joists, she could feel a very slight give when she pressed on them, the give of a board that is not fastened. She tested 3 boards, and all 3 were the same, unfastened, laid in place and held there by nothing but their own weight and the pressure of the boards around them. She put her face near the crack between 2 boards, and she could feel the air coming up. Not a draft, a breath. The same slow, deep, rhythmic breathing she had heard a minute before, coming from below, from the crawl space, from the darkness under the building. And it was warm. The air coming up through the crack was warm. Not hot, not heated. Warm, the way skin is warm, the way a living thing is warm. And it smelled of stone and of something else, something she could not name, something that was not mineral, and not vegetable, and not animal, and was, in a way she could not explain, old. It smelled old, not rotten, not decayed. Old the way deep water is old. Old the way bedrock is old. She pulled her face back and she sat on the floor of the chancel, and she looked at the boards and she thought, this floor is a lid. And then she thought, and they know it, because an unfastened floor in a 119-year-old church is not an accident. Floors do not come unfastened. Floors are nailed down and they stay nailed down unless somebody takes the nails out. Somebody had taken the nails out of the chancel floor, or had never put them in, and somebody had left those boards loose on purpose. And the only purpose she could think of for a loose floor over a crawl space that breathed warm air and smelled of deep stone was a purpose that made her sit very still for a long time. You do not nail down a lid you might need to open. She did not open it. Not that day. She put her clipboard down and she walked out of the church, and she sat on the front steps in the sunshine, and she smoked a cigarette, which was a habit she had given up in 1993 and taken back up in that moment because she had one in her glove box from a pack she kept for emergencies, and this felt like an emergency of a kind she did not have a form for. She sat on the steps and she smoked, and she looked at the cemetery, and she counted the stones in the oval, the old ones, the pre-1878 ones. 31. She could see them from where she sat, the small dark stones sunk into the grass, making their ring. And she thought about Dorothea's words, 27 underneath and 31 above. Cedric Colquitt had said that in 1904. 27 underneath. 31 was the number of graves in the oval. So 27 was the number of something else, something that was not in the cemetery, something that was underneath in a different sense. She finished the cigarette and went back in and spent the rest of the day on the interior survey, staying in the nave, staying away from the chancel floor, and the cold eased as the day went on, and by afternoon the church was merely cool, and the breathing was gone, or she had stopped hearing it. And she locked up at 4:30 and handed the key to Harlan Jessamine, who was already there with his padlocks, and she drove back to Goshen. On the 3rd day, Wednesday, the 8th of October, she went to the Harshaw County Courthouse. Nora spent 3 days in that basement, the 8th, 9th, and 10th of October, going through the county records for anything related to Coulter Methodist Church. She found the church meeting minutes going back to 1881. The property deed was there. The county land surveys were there. She found the tax records. She found the building permit, which was a single sheet that said, "Permission granted to build a church on Lot 22 of the Stillwell Branch Survey, signed by the county judge in April of 1878. And she found something she was not looking for, in a box labeled Miscellaneous Harshaw Co-Churches 1880 to 1920, between a water-stained survey of the Goshen Baptist Church and a receipt for $18 worth of roofing tin. It was a list. Handwritten. 1 page. Undated, but on paper that was clearly old, thick, fibrous, the kind of paper that was common in the Ozarks in the late 1800s. And on it, in a hand she did not recognize, was a column of names, 27 names. I am going to read them to you, because you need to hear them, and because when I am done, you will understand what is under that church. The names are these: Elspeth Pruitt, Hosea Call, Merritt Call the Elder, Jane Jessamine, Lem Pruitt, Cora Pruitt, Martha Call, Finis Jessamine, Mary Alt, Solomon Pruitt, Abel Jessamine the Elder, Parthenia Call the Elder, Lorna Call, James Pruitt, Grover Jessamine the Elder, Hattie Pruitt, Columbus Call, Rachel Jessamine, Virgil Pruitt, Dorcas Call, Pleasant Jessamine, Etta Pruitt, Hamilton Call, Bertie Jessamine, Larkin Pruitt, Ada Jessamine, Mercy Call, 27 names, 3 families, Call, Pruitt, Jessamine. The 3 families that settled the hollow, and every one of those names is also on a gravestone in the cemetery. Every one of those 27 names belongs to someone who was buried in the oval ring of stones between 1847 and 1878. They are the dead. The 31 graves include some people who are not on this list, but every person on this list is in one of those graves. So the 27 are not a different set of people from the 31. They are a subset. 27 of the 31, and the question that Nora Selwick stared at for an hour in that basement, the question that Cedric Colquitt's words had planted and that this list watered, was this: if these 27 names are the ones underneath, and their bodies are in the cemetery above, then what is underneath is not the bodies. It is the names. 27 names. Stored in the ground, held in the stone, kept alive by 119 years of being spoken aloud in a room built on top of them. And that is what the church was built on. Not a burial ground, not an Indian mound, not a geological formation, a list of names, old ones, anchored in the rock by something that the settlers found and the Osage had known about, and that Dorothea Jessamine's grandmother called a mouth in the ground, a place where sound goes down and does not come back. The ring of stones was not a wall. It was a frame. It was the boundary of a place where the ground listened, and the church, built inside the ring, was a room where people had been saying names out loud, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for 119 years, saying them in hymns, saying them in prayers, saying them in roll calls and in introductions, and in whispered conversations during the sermon, and in the calling of children to stop fidgeting, pouring names into the ground the way water pours into a well. And the ground had kept them all. Nora Selwick put the list back in the box, and she sat in the basement of the Harshaw County Courthouse under 3 working fluorescent tubes, and she understood for the first time what Dorothea Jessamine had meant when she said the church was studying. It was not learning to be a church. It was learning the names. It was learning who had been spoken into the ground. And at night, when nobody was there to interrupt it, it was saying them back, in order, in the voices they had been said in, the way a student recites a lesson. And the singing was not haunting. The singing was practice. Because a church service is not only a sermon and not only a prayer, a church service is a list of names. The minister calls the names of the saints. The congregation calls the names of the dead. The hymns are full of names. The prayers are full of names. Every Sunday morning in Coulter Methodist Church was, and had always been, a slow dictation of names into a ground that was listening, and now the ground was reading them back. I want to stop here and tell you about Nora's 4th and 5th days, because the 4th day is when it got personal, and the 5th day is when she understood that she could not leave, not because something was stopping her, because something was calling her, and it was calling her in a voice she knew. On Thursday, the 9th of October, she went back to the church. She had the key. She unlocked the door at 8 in the morning, and she counted the pews in her head, and she got 22, and she went to work. She spent the morning on the exterior, examining the foundation from the outside, documenting the mortar failure, measuring the gap on the northeast corner. Photographs came next. Notes filled her pad. She was professional, methodical, and scared in a way she had not been scared since her mother's last night, and she handled the fear the same way she had handled that, which was by doing the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, until the fear was buried under the work. At about 11 in the morning she came around the back of the building, the north side, and she stopped. The tree line. The woods behind the church come within about 30 feet of the back wall. Hardwood, oak, and hickory, and the dark trunks of old cedars, and the understory was doing what understory does in October, which is dying in color, sumac going red, and sassafras going orange, and Virginia creeper going a red so dark it looked like blood in the shade. And the edge of the woods was wrong. She stared at it for about 30 seconds, and then she blinked and looked again, and the tree line was ragged and ordinary, the way a tree line is supposed to be, and she could not make it go wrong again, and that was worse. She went inside. She spent the afternoon at the back of the nave, examining the pews, measuring the bolt patterns, noting the wood species and the joinery. She was at the 15th pew, on the left side, working from front to back, when she put her hand on the seat of the pew, and the wood was warm, not room temperature. Warm, the way a seat is warm when somebody has been sitting in it. She looked at the pew on either side. Cool. She put her hand back on the 15th pew. Warm. She put her hand on the hymnal rack. Warm. She put her hand on the iron end support. Warm. She stood up and looked at the pew as though looking at it would explain it, and it did not explain it, and she looked at the hymnals in the rack, and one of them was open, not face down, the way you leave a book you are coming back to. Open, held open to a page. She had not opened it. She had not touched the hymnals. The hymnal was open to page 216, and she looked at the page, and the hymn on page 216 was "Come, Thou Fount of Every Blessing," the same hymn she had heard at 3 in the morning on her first night. She picked up the hymnal and looked at it, and the page was marked. Not with a bookmark, with a crease. The page had been turned down at the corner, and the crease was old and soft, and she opened the hymnal to the front and on the inside cover, in pencil, in a hand that she knew she should not recognize but did, in a hand that was large and round and slightly left-leaning, the hand of a woman who wrote on blackboards for 22 years, there was a name, June Selwick, her mother's name, written in her mother's handwriting, in a hymnal in a church in Coulter, Missouri, 240 miles from Waynesville, in a building that her mother had never visited, in a town that her mother had never heard of, in a county that her mother could not have found on a map. Nora Selwick sat down in the 15th pew and held the hymnal in both hands and looked at her mother's name in her mother's handwriting and did not cry because she was past crying, and did not scream because she was past screaming, and sat there for a long time. And here is what she thought about. She thought about the list, the 27 names, the ground that kept names, the building that was learning them, and she thought, it did not get that name from a hymnal. It put that name in a hymnal. It was showing her that it knew. It knew who she had lost. It knew the name she carried in the deepest part of herself, the name that was grief and love and everything she had not been able to put down in 3 years. And it had written it in a hymnal and left it on a page that it had been singing at 3 in the morning, and it was not an accident, and it was not a coincidence, and it was not a test. It was a lure. She sat in that pew, and she thought about the singing. One voice, flat, loud, wrong, her mother's voice, and she thought about Dorothea's words. It uses what it has learned. And she thought about Cedric Colquitt going to the church at night in his bare feet, and she understood, sitting there, that the thing under the church had learned her, not by listening to her. She had only been there for 4 days. It had learned her the way it learned everything, which was through the names. It had her mother's name now, and that was enough. A name spoken into the ground or written on a page left in a room that was connected to the ground, was a thread, and the thing underneath could pull on threads. She also understood, and this is the part that matters, that she had not counted the pews out loud. Dale Elkins had told her to count them out loud. He had told her to start at the back left and go forward, and then start at the back right and go forward. He had told her to do it every time she went in. She had counted in her head, silently, like a professional, and she thought about Emmett Sparrow in that other story, in that other case I told you about a long time ago and many miles away, and about the roll call, and about the rule that you say your own name last. She had not said her name. She had not said anything out loud. She had walked into that church 4 times in 4 days, and she had not made a sound that would tell the building who she was. But it had found out anyway, because her grief had a name on it, and the name was June Selwick, and grief is the loudest thing a person carries, and a room that listens does not need you to speak for it to hear you. She put the hymnal back. It closed. She did not take it, and she did not tear the page out, and she did not know if those decisions were right. She walked out of the church, and she locked the door. And she stood on the steps, and she looked at the cemetery, and she counted the stones in the oval, 31. And she counted the ones she could see from the steps, and she got 31. And she thought 27 underneath, and 31 above, and one name in a hymnal that should not be there. And she did not know what she was going to do. She could have left. I want to say that plainly. She could have driven back to Springfield and written the assessment from her notes and submitted it to the foundation and never come back. She had enough for the report. She had the measurements, the photographs, the structural observations. The foundation did not need to know about the singing or the cold or the hymnal with her mother's name in it. She could have left. She did not leave. She did not leave because of the 5th day, which was the day she found the journal. And she did not leave because of what she heard on the night of the 4th day, Friday night, the night of the 10th of October, 1997, when she was lying in the motel in Goshen with the window unit dreaming, and she heard her mother's voice, not in the church, not over a distance, in the room, in the motel room, at 2 in the morning, as close and as clear as a person standing at the foot of the bed. It said 2 notes, just 2 notes, the first 2 notes of a hymn, and Nora knew which hymn it was before the second note had faded, because she had been playing that game since she was 7 years old, and the hymn was Be Thou My Vision, and it was the hymn that June Selwick had requested for her own funeral and that they had not sung because the choir director said it was too hard for the choir, and June had died without hearing it, and Nora had not forgiven the choir director, and had not forgiven herself for not insisting, and had carried those 2 unsung notes in her chest for 3 years like a splinter. 2 notes. In a motel room in Goshen, 14 miles from the church. The thing had followed her. Not the thing itself, the reach of it, the thread it had found, her grief, her mother's name, the unsung hymn. It had enough now. It had enough to find her anywhere she went, because grief has no walls and a name is a door, and once the thing under the church had a name it could use, the 14 miles between Coulter and Goshen were nothing. She lay in the motel room, and she heard the 2 notes, and she did not answer. And the 2 notes came again, and she did not answer. And they came a 3rd time, and the 3rd time they were followed by a click, a small, dry click, a thumbnail pressing into the pad of an index finger. 4 seconds, another click, and Nora Selwick, lying in the dark in a motel in Goshen, Missouri, at 2 in the morning on the 10th of October, 1997, put her hand over her own mouth and bit down on her own thumb to keep from saying, "Mama." She did not say it. She did not say anything. She lay there with her hand over her mouth and the tears going down into the pillow and the clicking going on. 4 seconds, click, 4 seconds, click, and after about 20 minutes it stopped, and the window unit went on dreaming, and she did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning she drove back to Coulter. She did not go to the church. She went to Dorothea Jessamine's porch, and she told her what had happened. All of it, flat, the way Mercy Pettigrew had told Desi Frayne, the way women in these stories tell the one person who will not call them crazy. She told her about the hymnal. She told her about the two notes. She told her about the clicking. And she told her about her mother, about June, about the singing and the two-note game and the thumbnail and the camphor. And Dorothea listened the way Desi had listened, without interrupting, with her hands around her coffee cup. And when Nora was done, Dorothea said, "It has your name now." Nora said, "I did not tell it my name." And Dorothea said, "You did not have to. You told it your grief, and your grief has a name on it, and that is enough. It knows your mother's name, and it knows your mother is dead, and it knows you miss her, and it will use that. It will use that as long as you let it." Nora asked what she should do, and Dorothea said, "You have two choices. You can leave, and it will follow you, and it will get quieter over time, because you will be farther from the ground, and in a year or 2 or 5, it will be only a sound you hear sometimes at 3 in the morning in a room you cannot explain, and you will learn to live with that. Or you can stay, and you can learn to count." And Nora said, "Count what?" And Dorothea said, "The pews. The way Dale told you. Out loud, every time. From the back left forward, and from the back right forward, 22. And your name last. Out loud, every time you go in. It is not a ward. It is not magic. It is a roll call. You are telling the room who is alive and who is in the room, and you are telling whatever is underneath that you know it is there, and that you are not one of its names. Because the thing underneath does not know the difference between the living and the dead. It only knows the names it has been given. And when you count the pews out loud and say your name at the end, you are telling it, "I am not yours. I am here. I am alive. And my name is not on your list," Nora said. "And if I count 23, and Dorothea Jessamine looked at her for a long time and said, "Then you leave. You leave, and you do not lock the door, and you do not come back. Because 23 means it has made a place for someone, and the someone it has made a place for is you." Now, the journal. On the morning of Saturday, the 11th of October, 1997, Nora Selwick went back to the church. She unlocked the front door. She stood in the vestibule, and for the first time, she counted the pews out loud. She started at the back left, the way Dale Elkins had told her. She said, 1, 2, 3, and she went forward, row by row, and her voice sounded small and strange in the cold room, the way your voice sounds in a room that is not used to hearing it. And when she got to 11, she crossed the aisle and started again at the back right. 12, 13, 14, all the way to 22. 22. And then, standing in the center aisle with her clipboard in one hand and her voice still hanging in the air, she said, "Nora Selwick," and the room changed. She could not have told you how. She could not have pointed at a thing that was different. But the quality of the air changed, the way the quality of a conversation changes when you say something true that everyone has been avoiding. The cold eased, a degree or two. The silence got more ordinary. The building settled, a creak in the roof, a tick in the window glass, the sounds a building makes when it is just a building. And she thought, "It heard me. It heard the count, and it heard the name, and it knows I am the living one." She worked all morning. She went through the nave, pew by pew, documenting the ironwork, the wood, the bolt holes. The windows got examined next. The plaster walls got measured. She was methodical, and she was thorough, and she was in a way that she recognized and did not fight, using the work to keep the fear at arm's length. At about 1 in the afternoon she went outside for a sandwich and sat on the steps and ate it, and looked at the cemetery, and a woman came up the road on foot. Her name was Opaline Call. She was 81 years old. She was the granddaughter of the Parthenia Call that Dorothea had mentioned, the woman who had known the most and died in 1947, and Opaline was the keeper of whatever Parthenia had passed down. She was not like Dorothea. Dorothea was sharp and dry and careful with her words. Opaline was something else. She was slow, not simple. Slow in the way that deep water is slow. She spoke as though each word had to come up from a long way down and be inspected before she let it out. She walked up, and she did not introduce herself. She stood at the bottom of the steps, and she looked at Nora and she said, "You counted." Nora said, "Yes." And Opaline said, "Good. Then I will tell you the rest of it. Dorothea told you the what. I am going to tell you the why, but not here. Not in sight of this building. Come to my house when you are finished today, and I will give you supper, and I will tell you what my grandmother told me, and I will tell you what is in the journal that you have not found yet, and I will tell you why you must not, under any circumstances, go under the floor." Then she turned around and walked back down the road, and Nora watched her go, and Nora thought, how did she know I was thinking about going under the floor? Because she had been thinking about it. Since the day she found the loose boards on the chancel, since the warm air and the breathing, the assessor in her wanted to see the foundation from the inside, which was a standard part of any structural survey. And the woman in her, the woman who had heard her mother's voice at 2 in the morning in a motel 14 miles away, wanted to see what was down there. She spent the afternoon in the church. She finished the nave survey. She started on the vestibule. And at about 3 o'clock, working along the west wall of the vestibule, she noticed something. The coat rack on the west side had 8 hooks. The coat rack on the east side had 8 hooks. They were iron, bolted to the wall, the same hooks that had been there since 1878, and they were at shoulder height, evenly spaced, and they were the kind of hooks that, in a country church, hold coats and hats and scarves and the occasional child's lunch pail. On the 3rd hook from the left on the west rack there was a scarf. It was folded. Hung neatly, the way you hang a scarf when you intend to come back for it. It was dark green wool, old, with a fringe on the ends, and it had been there since at least the day before, because she had seen it the day before and not thought about it. She had assumed it belonged to somebody who had left it after last Sunday's service. She picked it up. It was cold. Not room temperature cold, skin cold. The cold of a thing that has been against a body and is still holding the shape of the body's temperature in reverse, still cold where the body was warm, and it smelled of camphor. Nora put it back on the hook. She put it back carefully, in the same fold, on the same hook, and she stood in the vestibule, and she thought about her mother, who hated the smell of camphor more than anything in the world, and she thought about a room that learns, and she thought about what it means to learn a person's hatred, and she thought, it got the camphor wrong. It got the camphor wrong, because her mother hated camphor. If the thing under the church was trying to summon June Selwick, trying to make Nora feel her mother's presence, it would not use the smell that June despised. It would use the smell that June loved, which was coffee, which was chalk dust, which was the particular scent of the old Methodist hymnal that smelled of glue and paper and the hands of 100 years of singers. It would not use camphor. Camphor was the thing that drove June away, and that meant one of 2 things. Either the thing under the church did not understand the difference between a person's love and a person's aversion, between the things that draw us and the things that repel us, or it understood the difference perfectly, and the camphor was not a lure. It was a warning, something that knew June Selwick, or knew the shape of June Selwick's name in the ground, had put a camphor-scented scarf on a hook in the vestibule, not to bring Nora closer, but to push her away. And that meant there was something in that church, or under it, that was more complicated than a student reciting a lesson. There was something that was trying to help. Nora held that thought the way you hold a match in a wind. She did not trust it. She did not want to trust it, but she held it. She locked the church at 4:30 and walked down the road to Opaline Call's house, which was the last house on the east end, closest to the mouth of the hollow, farthest from the church. It was a log house, one of the original settlement houses, with a stone chimney and a porch that had been added in stages over 150 years, and showed it. There was a garden, winter dead, with the last of the tomato stakes standing in rows. There was a well with a wooden cover. There was a dog, old and blind, lying on the porch with its chin on its paws, and it did not lift its head when Nora came up the steps. Opaline was inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and beans and something herbal that Nora could not place, and it was warm, and the warmth was so welcome after the cold of the church that Nora stood in the doorway for a second and just breathed it. Opaline put a bowl of beans and cornbread in front of her and a glass of water and sat down across the table, and she said, "Eat first, then I will talk." Nora ate. She ate the way a person eats who has been cold for 5 days and did not know it until she got warm. She ate 2 bowls and did not apologize for it. Then Opaline talked. She talked for 3 hours. And I am going to give you the whole of it, because it is the cosmology of this case, and it is the reason the church is locked, and it is the reason the pews must be counted, and it is the explanation for the 23rd pew. Opaline said that her grandmother, Parthenia Call, was the last person in the hollow who knew the full history of the ground the church sits on. Parthenia had it from her own grandmother, who was there in 1844, and from a woman of the Osage who came through the hollow in 1871 on her way to somewhere else and stayed 3 days and talked to no one but the Calls. The Osage woman, Opaline said, had no name that she gave. She came in the fall, on foot, alone, and she was old. Straight to the ring of stones she walked, as though she knew where it was, and she stood in it for a long time, and then she came to the Call house, and she sat on the porch, and she talked to Parthenia's grandmother for 2 evenings. The ground inside the ring, she said, was thin. She did not say thin ground and mean it the way we use the word. She said thin the way you would say thin ice, a place where the surface is not as solid as it seems, a place where things below can hear things above, and things above can, if they are not careful, fall through. She said the ring of stones was not a wall. It was a mark, a warning. The people who put the stones there, her people or people older than her people, had put them there to say, "This ground listens. Do not speak to it. Do not give it your name. Do not give it your dead." And what she said next, Opaline told Nora, was the sentence that her family had carried for 126 years. She said, "The ground in that place has a memory. Not the way we have memory. We remember what happened to us. That ground remembers what was said to it. It keeps every word that has ever been spoken into it, the way a well keeps water. And the water does not go bad. It does not get old. It stays and it rises. And if you build a house over a well, you will hear the water in your sleep. And if you build a church over a mouth, you will hear the names in the dark. A mouth, the same word Abel Jessamine used in 1878 when he voted against building the church on that spot. You are building a church on a mouth. Opaline said, "My grandmother asked the woman, 'What happens if the mouth gets full? If 100 years of names poured into the ground would fill it up the way a well fills up?' And the woman said, 'No.' She said, 'It does not fill.' She said, 'It learns.' She said that a mouth that has heard enough names begins to understand what names are for. And what names are for, she said, is calling. Names call things. That is what names do. You say a name, and you call the thing that has that name. You say the name of the dead, and you call the dead. You say the name of the living, and you call the living. And a mouth in the ground that has heard enough names, spoken enough times, with enough feeling behind them, begins to call on its own, not because it wants to, because that is what a mouthful of names does. It calls, and when it calls, Opaline said, two things happen. The first is that the dead hear it. The dead who were buried inside the ring, whose names were set into the ground, whose names the ground has kept for a century or more. They hear their names being called, from below, from the stone, from the thin place under the church, and they answer. Not the way the living answer. The dead answer by moving. They shift, they stir. They turn in the ground, the way a sleeper turns when someone whispers their name. And that is why the graves in the oval have sunk, every one of them, deeper than they should be, deeper than 150 years of settling can account for. The bodies are sinking, slowly, toward the voice that is calling them the way you sink toward a voice calling your name in a dream. And the second thing is that the living hear it too. Not the calling, the practicing, the singing, the voices, the names spoken at 3 a.m. The living hear the church rehearsing, and some of them are drawn to it, and some of them are warned by it, and which one you are depends on what you have lost. If you have lost someone whose name the ground knows, you are drawn. You hear the voice of your dead person, and you want to go closer. You want to open the door. You want to sit in the pew and listen to your mother sing, or hear your husband say your name, or feel your child's hand on the back of the pew in front of you. And if you go in at night when the church belongs to the mouth learns you too. It learns your name and your grief and your voice, and it adds you to the list. And if you have not lost someone, or if you have lost someone whose name the ground does not know, you feel the other thing. You feel the warning, the cold, the silence, the sense that the building is paying attention, and you lock the door, and you go home, and you do not go back in the dark. That is why the lock is on the outside. It is not to keep the thing in. It is to keep the grieving out. Opaline said this, and then she was quiet for a long time, and Nora sat with it, and outside the window the dark had come in, and the hollow was black, and the only light was the kerosene lamp on the table, because Opaline Call did not have electricity, and never had. Then Nora asked the question she had been holding since the afternoon. She asked about the camphor. She asked about the scarf. And Opaline looked at her and said, "That was not the mouth. That was someone else." Nora said, "Who?" And Opaline said, "Margaret Voss, the 11th minister, the one who lasted 7 years, the one who understood. She left something behind when she went. And it was not just the journal. She left a piece of herself in that building, the way a teacher leaves a piece of herself in a schoolroom. Not a ghost, not a haunting, a practice. She practiced every day for 7 years, and her practice is still in the room, and her practice sometimes pushes back against the mouth, the way a teacher pushes back against a student who is learning the wrong lesson. Nora asked what Margaret Voss's practice was. And Opaline said, she counted. Every day, 22 pews, out loud, her name at the end. But she also did something else. She counted the things the mouth got wrong. She kept track of every mistake it made, every detail it missed, every voice it could not quite get right. And she wrote them down. And I believe, though I cannot prove it, that the journal is still in the parsonage, under the floor, where she put it in 1948. Nora asked why it mattered what the mouth got wrong. And Opaline said the sentence that sits at the center of this whole case, the sentence that is the reason Nora Selwick is alive. She said, because the mistakes are the only proof that it is not real, and the day it stops making mistakes is the day the last Sunday comes. Nora went back to the parsonage the next morning. The parsonage was not the same building that the Colquitts had used. That building had been replaced in the 20s. The current parsonage was a 3-room frame house about a quarter-mile from the church, last occupied by a minister in 1982, empty since then, used for storage by the Jessamine family. It was locked. Harlan Jessamine gave her the key without comment. The house was cold, but it was a normal cold, the cold of a building that has not been heated in 15 years. There was no breathing. There was no presence. It was just a small, dusty, empty house with a kitchen and a front room and a bedroom and a bathroom that had been added in the 40s. She found the journal in about 20 minutes. She went to the bedroom, which had a plank floor, pine, and she got on her hands and knees and looked for loose boards, because she was a woman who read buildings, and a loose board in a house is the same as a loose board in a church, which is a lid. There was a loose board against the east wall, near the corner, under where a bed would have been. She pried it up with a screwdriver. Underneath, in the space between the floor and the ground, wrapped in oilcloth, was a metal box about the size of a bread loaf. Inside the box was a notebook, not a spiral. A bound composition book, black, the kind with the marbled cover. It was in good condition, dry. The oilcloth had done its work. On the inside cover, in a clear, firm teacher's hand, it said, Margaret Voss, Coulter, Harshaw County, Missouri. Observations. Begun September 1941. Nora sat on the floor of the empty bedroom and opened the journal and began to read. I am going to give you the journal the way Nora got it, which is to say, in Margaret Voss's own voice, in her own words, in the order she wrote them. And I want you to hear her, because Margaret Voss is the smartest person in this story, and the bravest, and the one who came closest to understanding what the mouth is, and the one who paid the most for the understanding. The journal runs 212 pages. The first 50 are dated entries, daily, from September 1941 through February 1942, and they are the systematic observations of a woman trained in divinity school who is treating a supernatural phenomenon as a research subject. The middle 100 pages cover the next 6 years in less detail, with entries every few days or every week, and they are the record of a woman who has moved from observation to management, who is trying not to understand the mouth but to live with it. And the last 62 pages are different. They are not dated. They are not observations. They are something else. They are a set of instructions, written in the second person, addressed to whoever finds the journal, and they are the closest thing this case has to a survival manual. Let me start with the early entries. She kept meticulous records. Daily entries in the first months, weekly after that. She counted the pews every morning. She developed a rating system. October 7th, 1941. I have begun to keep a chart. Each morning I count the pews, say my name, and take the temperature of each pew by hand. I note which pews are cold and which are ambient. I have 5 days of data. The pattern is this. On 4 of the 5 days, 1 pew was cold. It was never the same pew twice. On the 5th day, October 5th, no pews were cold. That was a Sunday, the day the congregation was in the building. I do not know what to make of that yet, but I note it. It is getting better. That is the thing that concerns me. Whatever is producing this sound is improving the way a student improves with practice. October 22nd, 1941. I went to the church tonight. I know. Merritt Call told me not to. Dorothea told me not to. Every instinct I have told me not to. But I am a minister, and this is my church, and I cannot do my work if I am afraid to go into my own building. I went at 11 o'clock. I took a lantern. I unlocked the front door, and I went in. I counted the pews out loud. 22. I said my name. I sat down in the front pew, and I waited. At 11:27, By my watch, the singing began. It was not coming from the ceiling. It was not coming from the walls. It was coming from the floor, from below, from the crawl space, from the stone, from the ground underneath the foundation. And it was not a recording, and it was not an echo, and it was not the wind. It was a voice, and it was singing Rock of Ages. And it was singing it in a voice I recognized. It was my voice, my cadence, my breath, my pitch, and it was singing Rock of Ages the way I had sung it the previous Sunday, with the same slight rush on the second line of the third verse that I always make because the words are too many for the notes. I sat in the pew, and I listened to myself sing from under the floor, and I will tell you plainly that it was the most frightening experience of my life. And I have been in this profession for 16 years, and I have sat with the dying, and I have buried the dead, and I have stood in rooms where men with guns were arguing about who owned the Word of God, and none of that was as frightening as sitting in a cold church at 11:30 at night and hearing my own voice come up through the floor. But here is the important thing. Here is the thing I stayed to hear. It was not perfect. It had my voice, it had my words, it had my timing, but it did not have me. There was something missing from it, the way there is something missing from a wax figure, the way there is something missing from a photograph of a person you love. It had the shape of my voice, and not the soul of it, and if I had not been there to hear it, if I had been 3 rooms away or 3 miles away, I would not have been able to tell the difference. But I was there. I was sitting 6 feet above it, listening, and I could tell. And I realized, sitting there, that this was the most important thing I could do with my time in this church. Not exercise it, not fight it, not ignore it. Listen to it. Keep track of what it gets wrong. Monitor its progress. Measure the gap between what it does and what is real, because the gap is closing, and someone needs to be watching when it closes. That is the last entry I am going to read you from the early section of the journal, because the next 100 pages are more of the same, more data, more measurements, more night visits, more charts, and I do not want to lose you in the data. But I want to give you the summary of what Margaret Voss found over 7 years of listening. At that rate, she calculated, it would reach a 10 sometime around 1980, give or take a decade. She was off by about 17 years. It reached something very close to a 10 in the fall of 1997, which is when Nora Selwick showed up, which is when it sang in June Selwick's voice at 3 in the morning, and got the hymn right, and the pitch right, and the flatness right, and the loudness right, and the only thing it got wrong was the camphor, which it used instead of coffee, because it did not understand the difference between love and hatred, which is the one thing it had never learned, which is the one gap that Margaret Voss had been watching for, and which is the one gap that, in 27 years since, has never quite closed. Almost, but not quite, not yet. Now I want to go back to the church, because the next 4 days are where this story turns from an investigation into a survival, and I need you inside the building for it. On Monday, the 13th of October, 1997, Nora Selwick went into Coulter Methodist Church for the 7th time. She unlocked the front door. She stood in the vestibule. She counted the pews out loud, from the back left forward, 1 through 11, and then from the back right forward, 12 through 22, 22 pews. And she said, out loud, Nora Selwick, and this time she felt it. Not the easing she had felt before. Something else. Something that was not a change in temperature or a change in sound, but a change in attention. The building was paying attention to her in a way it had not been paying attention before. She had counted, and it had heard the count, and it had heard her name, and she could feel it thinking about her name the way you can feel someone behind you reading over your shoulder. She went to the chancel. She had decided, overnight, that she was going to look at the chancel floor again. Not lift it, not go under, just look. She had Margaret Voss's journal with her, and she had read the last 62 pages the night before, the instruction pages, and what those pages said about the chancel floor was this. Margaret Voss wrote, "The floor at the front of the church is not a floor, it is a membrane. The boards are not nailed because they must not be nailed. They rest on the joists the way a drumhead rests on a frame, and they vibrate, and the vibration is how the sound gets through. If you nail them down, the sound cannot get through, and the mouth compensates. It finds another way." In 1943, I experimented with nailing down 3 boards on the east side of the chancel. Within a week, the singing moved to the nave. It was coming up through the nailed-down floor in the seating area, which is nailed down and always has been. The sound was muffled and distorted, like a voice heard through water, but it was louder, as though the mouth was pushing harder to be heard through a thicker barrier. I removed the nails from the chancel boards, and the sound returned to its normal location and volume within 2 days. The chancel floor is the speaker. Do not block the speaker. If you block the speaker, the mouth will build a new one, and you will not control where it builds it. Nora read that passage 3 times, and then she read the next one, which said, "There is something under the chancel that is not foundation. I have looked through the cracks. There is the crawl space, approximately 3 feet, dirt floor, limestone walls, and below the crawl space, in the center, directly under the altar, there is a hole. I cannot see the bottom of it. I dropped a stone through the crack once, and I did not hear it land. I dropped a second stone and counted to 40 and did not hear it land. I did not drop a third. The hole is the mouth. The hole is what the ring of stones marks. The hole is what the church was built on. I do not know how deep it goes. I do not know what is at the bottom. I know that sound goes into it and does not come back out the same. Do not go into the crawl space. I went once, in 1944, and what I found there I have not written down, and I am not going to write it down, because I do not want the person who finds this journal to go looking for it, because looking for it is how you feed it. I will say this. The walls of the crawl space, the limestone blocks, have marks on them. They are not tool marks. They are not mineral deposits. They are letters. They are names. Cut into the stone, or pressed into it, or grown into it the way lichen grows into rock, I cannot tell which. And they are the 27 names, the same 27 names that are on the graves and on the list and in the ground, 27 names, written on the inside of the foundation, facing inward, facing the hole, as though the stones themselves are speaking the names into the dark. I do not know who put them there. The foundation was laid by a man named Clement Race in 1878, and Clement Race left the hollow over the ridge and did not take the road home, and I think now I know why. Do not go under the floor. Nora read that, and she closed the journal, and she put it in her bag, and she went to the chancel floor, and she put her face to the crack between 2 boards, and she looked down. She could see the crawl space, dirt floor, limestone walls, the dim gray light of a space that has no windows and gets its light from the cracks in the floor above and the gaps in the foundation stones. She could see about 4 feet in any direction, and she could see the marks on the stone. Margaret Voss had not described them well enough. They were not just letters. They were not just names. They were names carved in a style that Nora, with her training in historic preservation, recognized immediately because she had seen it on 100 gravestones across the Ozarks. It was the style of a stonecutter in the mid-19th century, the plain block capitals with the serifs filed in by hand, the kind of lettering that you see on every gravestone between 1840 and 1880 in the rural South. Elspeth Pruitt, Hosea Call, Jane Jessamine, 27 names. Cut into the inside of the foundation, facing inward. She pulled her face back, and she sat on the chancel floor, and she looked at the crack she had been looking through, and she thought about Margaret Voss's warning, and she thought about the hole, and she thought about a stone dropped through the crack that did not land, and she did not go under the floor, not that day. On Tuesday, the 14th of October, the singing came back. She had been staying in the motel in Goshen, driving the 14 miles each way, and on Monday night she had lain in the dark and heard nothing. No voice, no two notes, no clicking. The silence of an ordinary motel room. She had slept, badly, but she had slept, and she had felt, for the first time in a week, that the reach of the thing did not extend to Goshen, that the counting and the naming had done something, that she had drawn a line, and the line was holding. On Tuesday she went back to Coulter, and counted the pews, and said her name, and worked all day. She was now into the final phase of the assessment, the foundation survey, which was the part that required getting close to the ground. She examined the exterior of the foundation from all four sides, photographing every stone, every joint, every crack, every place where the mortar had failed or the stone had shifted. She documented the gap on the northeast corner, which was now slightly wider than it had been a week ago, though she told herself that was her imagination, and noted it on the form with a question mark. She finished at about 4 o'clock and locked up, and was standing in the gravel lot when she heard, from inside the church, a sound, not singing, not a voice, a sound like furniture moving, a heavy, slow, scraping sound, wood on wood, and then a pause, and then it again, as though something heavy were being dragged across the floor, an inch at a time, with rests between. She stood in the parking area and listened to the sound for about 3 minutes. It came from the front of the building, from the chancel area, and it stopped. She did not go back in. She drove back to Goshen. On Tuesday night, at 2:15 in the morning, the singing came back. It was getting closer. She lay in the dark, and she could hear it growing louder, the way a sound grows louder when the source is approaching, and she thought, "It is walking. It is on the road. It is walking toward Goshen." She got out of bed, and she went to the window, and she looked out at the parking lot and the road beyond it. There was a street light at the corner, orange, the kind that turns the world the color of rust, and the road was empty, and the singing was getting louder. She could not see anything. There was nothing on the road, no figure, no shape, no shadow, just the sound, growing louder, coming closer, as though the voice itself were walking without a body, as though the singing were a thing that could move through space on its own. And then it was in the parking lot. And then it was at the window, and they were singing her name. Nora stood at the window of the Sycamore Motor Court and listened to 100 dead voices sing her mother's favorite hymn with her name threaded through it like a needle through cloth, and she did the only thing she could think of. She counted. She did not know what she was counting. She did not know if it would work. She did not know if the pew-counting ritual that Dale Elkins and Margaret Voss and Opaline Call had all insisted on had any power outside the building. But she counted. She counted to 22, out loud, standing at the window in her nightgown, and when she got to 22, she said her name, Nora Selwick, out loud, into the dark. And the singing stopped, not faded, stopped, between one note and the next, as though a door had been closed on it. She stood at the window and looked at the parking lot, and the parking lot was empty, and the road was empty, and the street light hummed, and a car went by on the highway a quarter mile away, and the world was ordinary again. And Nora Selwick made a decision. She made the decision standing at that window at 2:30 in the morning, with the counting still on her lips, and the silence still ringing, and her hands still shaking. And the decision was this: she stayed. Not out of bravery, not out of stubbornness. She stayed because she understood that the thing under the church was getting better. 1% a year, and the people who had been containing it were getting old, and somebody had to measure the gap so that the next person who came would know what they faced. And then the church would be empty, and the mouth would practice in peace. And the last Sunday would come, the camphor. The mouth had used camphor to evoke June Selwick. It had used the smell that June hated, which meant the mouth did not understand hate. It did not understand the difference between a thing that draws a person and a thing that repels them. It had learned the shape of love, but not the direction of it. It could imitate the voice and the habits and even the specific pitch of the singing, but it could not tell love from its opposite. That was the gap. In 1997, the gap was this. The thing under the church did not understand repulsion. It knew what drew people. It did not know what drove them away. And until it learned that distinction, it could not hold a service by itself, because a real church service is not only calling. A real church service is calling and dismissal. Come in and go out. Welcome and amen. And the thing under the church could do the come in but not the go out, because it did not know what pushing away felt like. Nora Selwick lay in the dark in Goshen and held that thought and felt, for the first time in a week, that she had something. Not a weapon, not a shield, a measurement, a way to tell how close the mouth was to finishing its education. In the morning she drove back to Coulter. On Wednesday, the 15th of October, she did not go to the church. She went to Opaline Call's house. She told Opaline what she had found in the journal. She told her about the voices on the road. She told her about the counting at the window and the singing stopping. And she told her about the camphor, and about the gap, and about Margaret Voss's measurement, and about her own conclusion. Opaline listened. She listened the way deep water listens, taking everything in and giving nothing back until the surface was still. Then she said two things. The first thing she said was, Margaret Voss was the best of them. She was the best of all 14, and she lasted the longest, and she understood the most, and she left because she had to, because by 1948 the mouth had her voice so well that she could not tell the difference anymore. She could not tell, sitting in the church at night, whether the singing was the mouth or her own echo, and she understood that meant the gap had closed for her. Not for everybody, just for her. Because the mouth learns the person who listens to it best, the way a student learns the teacher who teaches it the most. And 7 years was too long. 7 years, and the mouth had her completely, voice and habit and the rhythm of her breathing, and she knew that if she stayed one more night, she would go to the church and not come back, because the voice she heard would be her own. And how do you resist a call that sounds exactly like yourself? She left. She left the journal under the floor. She left the instructions for whoever came next, and she went back to St. Louis, and she lived another 31 years, and in those 31 years she never once went into a church without counting. The second thing Opaline said was this. She said, the third of the three things Dale told you, the one about counting 23. I need you to understand what that means, because Margaret Voss understood it, and you need to understand it the same way. The 22 pews are the building. They are the room as it was built, as it has stood for 119 years, as the living have made it. 22 pews, 11 on each side. That is the human number. That is how many seats the builders put in the room. If you count 23, it means the mouth has made its own pew. It has added a seat, and a seat in a church is an invitation. Every pew is a place that says, sit here, stay, be part of the congregation. A 23rd pew is a seat made by the thing underneath for the thing underneath. It is the mouth making a place for itself in the room, and it means the mouth is no longer content to be below. It is coming up. Nora asked what would happen if it came up, and Opaline said, I do not know. My grandmother did not know. But she said that the old people, the ones who put the stones in the ground, believed that the mouth is not evil and not good. The mouth is empty. It is a place that wants to be full. And it has been listening to a church for 119 years, and it has learned what a church does, and what a church does is fill itself with people, and the mouth wants to be full of people the way a church is full of people, and if it ever gets all the way up, if it ever finishes learning and holds its own service in its own pew, in its own voice, then the ground will open, and everything above will go below, and the mouth will be full, and then it will be quiet, Opaline said. And then it will start over. Nora asked how long the cycle was, how long between one filling and the next, and Opaline said, "My grandmother said the Osage woman told her that the mouth fills about once every 300 years, and that the ring of stones was placed there after the last time by the people who came after, to mark the place, so that nobody would build on it again. 300 years. Give or take a century." Nora sat in Opaline's kitchen and felt the weight of that, and she asked one more question. She asked about the names on the list, the 27. She asked why those 27 out of the 31 buried in the oval were the ones the ground had kept. Nora said, "So every name that has ever been spoken in that church is in the ground, and the mouth had all of them." Nora said, "Is my mother's name in the ground?" And Opaline said, "You brought it in with you. You carried it in the way you carry everything, and the building heard you, and the building passed it down." Nora said, "And now the mouth can use it." And Opaline said, "Yes, and it will. It will use it tonight and tomorrow night and the night after that. It will sing in her voice, and it will say your name, and it will try to make you answer, because that is what it does. It calls, and all you can do is what Margaret Voss did. Count, say your name, listen for the mistakes, and do not, under any circumstances, answer it in a voice it can keep." Nora asked what that meant, and Opaline said, "Do not answer it with love. Do not answer it with grief. Do not answer it with your mother's name on your lips, and your mother's absence in your voice, because that is the voice it wants, the voice that carries the door in it, the voice that says, 'I would give anything to hear you one more time.' That voice is an invitation, and the mouth accepts invitations. You answer it with the count. You answer it with your name. You answer it with the flat, plain, living fact of yourself, and you keep that answer as small and as dry as a stone." And then Opaline said one more thing, and it is the thing that sits at the bottom of this story like a stone at the bottom of a well. She said, "My grandmother counted every day of her life. She counted from the time she was old enough to understand until the day she died in 1947. And on the day she died, she was 91 years old, and she had been counting for 73 years. And the last thing she said, in the bed in this house, was 22. And then her name, and then she was gone. And when they buried her in the cemetery, inside the ring, they put a stone on her grave with her name on it, and the name was Parthenia Call, and her name, I know, is on the walls of the crawl space. I have not been down there. I will never go down there, but I know it is there, because every name that is spoken above the mouth ends up on the walls of the mouth, and her name was spoken more times than any other name in the history of that building, and the mouth knows her better than it knows anybody. And if I go into that church at 3 in the morning, Opaline said, the voice I will hear is my grandmother's, and it will be perfect. It will be so perfect that I would not be able to tell the difference, and that is why I have not been inside that church after dark in 50 years, and that is why I will not, and that is why the lock is on the outside of the door, because I am not strong enough, Opaline said. I would answer. I would hear my grandmother's voice, and I would answer her, and the door would open, and the mouth would have me. That is the whole of the cosmology. That is why the church is locked from the outside every night. Not to keep the dead in, to keep the living out. Because the living carry the names of the dead, and the names of the dead are what the mouth is made of, and a grieving person standing in a dark church listening to the voice of someone they have lost is the most dangerous thing in the world, because that person will answer, and the answer is the door. Now, let me take you through the last 4 days, because the last 4 days are the ones that broke it open. On Thursday, the 16th of October, 1997, Nora went back to the church. She counted. She said her name. 22 pews. She went to work. She had decided to do the one thing she had been told not to do. She was going under the floor, not because she was reckless, not because she wanted to see the names on the walls or the hole in the center. She was going under because she was a structural engineer by training and a preservationist by trade, and the foundation survey was the one part of the assessment she could not complete from above. If the foundation was compromised, if the stones were shifting, if the mortar failure she had documented on the exterior extended to the interior walls, then the building was in danger, and the foundation money would need to go to the foundation, and she could not write that in her report without looking at it. That was the professional reason. There was also another reason, and it was this: she needed to see it. She needed to see the names on the walls and the hole in the center, because she was a person who measured things, and the gap between the imitation and the real was a measurement she could not take from outside. She told Harlan Jessamine she was going under. She told him at 8 in the morning, on the front steps, and he looked at her and said nothing for about 15 seconds, which is a very long time for a man to say nothing while looking at you. Then he said, "I will leave the locks off until noon. If you are not out by noon, I am coming in after you." She said she would be out by noon. He said, "I did not say I would come in after you underground. I said I would come in after you," meaning into the church, "and I would lock the doors behind me, and whatever happened after that would happen, and that is the end of what I have to say about it." She understood. If she got stuck underground, or if something happened to her under the floor, Harlan Jessamine was not going to crawl under the church to get her. He was going to lock the building with her in it, because whatever was under the floor was under the floor, and the lock was between it and the world, and the lock stayed. In she went. 22. Her name came out steady. She went to the chancel. She pried up one of the loose boards, lifted it, and set it aside. The opening was about 10 inches wide and 3 feet long, and below it was the crawl space, about 3 feet deep, dirt floor, limestone walls, and the dim gray light of a space that has never seen the sun. She lowered herself down. She looked at the walls. The names were there, cut into the limestone in 19th century stone-cutting style, the original 27 near the base, and above them, smaller, newer names, going all the way to the joists. Hundreds. Names from gravestones, names of people never buried there but spoken of in the church. 119 years of prayer and praise cut into stone by something with no hands. But there were more. Margaret Voss had seen the 27 in 1944. Nora Selwick was looking at the walls in 1997, 53 years later. And in those 53 years, the walls had filled up, because she recognized some of them. The walls were full. And in the center of the crawl space, directly under the altar, she found the hole. Margaret Voss had described it as a hole. That is not what it was, or rather, it was a hole the way a throat is a hole. It was an opening in the bedrock, roughly circular, about 3 feet across, with smooth sides that went down into darkness. The edges were worn smooth, not cut, worn, as though something had been passing through that opening for a very long time, polishing the stone. She lay on her stomach at the edge of it and pointed the flashlight down. The beam went down about 10 feet, and then it stopped. Not because it hit something, because the light could not go further. The darkness below the 10-foot mark was not ordinary darkness. It was a darkness that had weight. The flashlight beam ended at a clean line, as though the light were being cut off by something solid, and below that line there was nothing. not even darkness. Just an absence. And from that absence, from below the line where the light stopped, she could feel the warmth rising, the same warmth she had felt through the cracks in the chancel floor. Body warmth, living warmth, the warmth of something that breathed and was breathing now, slowly, steadily, in a rhythm she recognized. It was the rhythm of a congregation breathing between hymns, the long, slow, collective inhale of 30 people about to sing. She lay at the edge of the hole and she felt the warm air on her face, and she smelled the deep stone smell, and she thought, "It is down there. Whatever it is down there, and it is waiting. And it has been waiting for 300 years, and it is almost ready." And then she heard something that made her begin to move backward, carefully, slowly, on her stomach in the dirt. She heard a voice. From below, from the hole, one voice, clear, close, as though the speaker were standing 10 feet down in the shaft, looking up at her. The voice said her name, not Nora, not Miss Selwick. It said her full name, Nora June Selwick, and it said it in her mother's voice. And it said it the way her mother said it when she was angry, which was rare, which made it worse, because when June Selwick said your full name in that voice, it meant you had done something that could not be undone. Nora June Selwick. And then the voice said, "Come down here, honey. Come down here and let me see you." And Nora Selwick, lying on her stomach in the dark under a church in the Ozarks, with her face 3 feet from a hole in the bedrock that went down into something that was not a cave, and was not a well, and was not anything that had a name, did the thing that saved her life. She counted to 22 out loud, in a voice that was steady because she would not let it be anything else. And when she got to 22, she said, "Nora Selwick," and the voice in the hole stopped. It did not stop the way a person stops talking. It stopped the way a bell stops ringing when you put your hand on it. A sudden pressed silence, as though the counting had touched it and it had gone still. She moved backward. She moved as fast as she could on her stomach in a 3-foot crawl space, and she got to the opening in the chancel floor, and she pulled herself up, and she put the board back, and she stood in the chancel with dirt on her clothes and her hands shaking. The church was quiet, the ordinary quiet of a cold room on an October morning. No breathing, no warmth. The hole below was sealed by the boards, and the boards were the membrane, and the membrane was holding, and she was on the right side of it. She looked at her watch. It was 10:45. She had been under the floor for 2 hours and 15 minutes. It had felt like 20 minutes. She went outside. Harlan Jessamine was standing in the parking area. He had been there for 2 hours and 15 minutes, she realized. Standing in the gravel, waiting, with his padlocks in his hand. She walked up to him and she said, "I went under." And he said, "I know." And she said, "I found the hole." And he said, "I know that too." And she said, "It said my name." And Harlan Jessamine, who was 71 years old, who had been locking that church every night since he was 19, who had never in his life spoken about what was under the building, said, "It said everybody's name." That is all it does. It says your name and it asks you to come down. And if you come down, it keeps you. And if you do not come down, it keeps your name, and it practices your name, and at night it says your name back to you in a voice you love, and it does that forever, and you lock the door, and you go home, and you do not answer. That is the plainest statement of the case that anyone in Coulter ever made, and he made it standing in a gravel parking lot in the October sunshine, and then he went up the steps and locked the church, and it was not yet noon. That night Nora slept at Opaline Call's house. She did not go back to the motel in Goshen. She went to Opaline's house, and she sat at the table, and she told her what she had found, and Opaline listened, and Opaline said, "Now you know." And Nora said, "Yes." And Opaline said, "What are you going to do?" And Nora said, I am going to write the report. I am going to recommend the foundation fund, the roof repair, and the foundation work. And I am going to recommend that the building be preserved, because if this building comes down, if the roof fails and the walls come in and the floor gives way, the membrane is gone, the lid is off, and the mouth is open. And Opaline said, "That is what my grandmother said. That is what Margaret Voss said. That is what every person in Coulter who understands has said for 119 years. Keep the building standing. Keep the services going. Keep the lock on the door, because the building is not the problem. The building is the solution. The building is the only thing between the mouth and the sky." That is why Dorothea Jessamine wrote to the Ozarks Heritage Foundation, not because the church was a historic treasure, though it was, because the church was a cage, and the cage was falling apart. On Friday, the 17th of October, Nora went back to the church for the last time during the day. She counted. She said her name. 22 pews. She finished the exterior survey. She took her final photographs. She wrote her notes. She packed her equipment. And at 4 o'clock, before Harlan came with the padlocks, she stood in the center aisle, and she did something that was not in Margaret Voss's journal, and was not in Opaline's instructions, and was not in Dale Elkins's 3 rules. She spoke to it. She stood in the center aisle, and she said, out loud, in a voice that was calm and clear, "I know you are there. I know what you are. I do not know your name, and I do not want to know your name. I am leaving tomorrow. My name is Nora Selwick, and I am alive, and I am leaving. You have my mother's name. You cannot have mine." The room was still. The cold was still. The silence was still. And then, from below, from under the chancel floor, from the hole in the bedrock, a voice said, very quietly, very calmly, in a voice that was not her mother's, and not anybody else's, and was, perhaps, its own, the first time she had heard its own voice, a voice like stone and water and deep time. It said, "I already have it." And then it said nothing else, and the cold eased, and the room was just a room, and Nora Selwick walked out of Coulter Methodist Church at 4:15 on the afternoon of Friday, the 17th of October, 1997, and she did not know, walking out, that she would be back one more time, because the last night had not happened yet. On Saturday morning, the 18th of October, Nora packed her car. Opaline held both her hands and said nothing. Dorothea gave her a jar of preserves and said, "Count." She did not say goodbye to Harlan. He was not a man who expected goodbyes. She saw him in the road as she pulled out, and he raised one hand, and she raised one hand, and that was it. County Road 12 unspooled ahead. The Ford came and went. She came through the woods and out onto the paved road, and she drove the 7 miles into Goshen. At the motel, she stopped to pick up her things. A toiletry bag was still in the room, and she went into the room and picked it up and sat on the bed and thought about driving home to Springfield and writing the report and being done with it. And she thought about the voice in the hole. "I already have it. I already have your name." She thought about Margaret Voss's journal, the last section, the instructions. The instructions said one thing that she had not yet done. The instructions said, "Before you leave, go into the church at night. Go in and count and say your name and sit in the front pew and listen. Listen for the mistake. Find the one thing it gets wrong, because that is the thing you will carry with you. That is the thing that will keep you sane when you hear the singing at 3 in the morning for the rest of your life. Not a ward, not a prayer, just the knowledge that it is not perfect, that it cannot do what the real thing does, that the gap exists. Find the gap, hold the gap. The gap is the only thing between you and the door." Nora sat on the bed in the motel in Goshen, and she made a decision. She drove back to Coulter. She arrived at about 7 in the evening. It was dark. The hollow was dark. The road was dark. Her headlights cut through the cedars, and the church was there, white and gray in the headlights, and the padlocks were on the doors. She parked in the gravel lot. She got out. She had the key. She stood in the dark, and she looked at the padlock on the front door, and she thought about every person who had ever been warned not to go in at night, and about every one of them who had gone in anyway, and about what had happened to them, and about what had happened to Cedric Colquitt, who went in at night and knelt at the altar and said, "She is teaching me the names." And she thought about Margaret Voss, who went in at night and sat in the front pew and listened and measured and survived. 7 years. 7 years of going in at night and coming out in the morning with one more data point. 7 years of measuring the gap. She put the key in the padlock and turned it, and the lock opened. She opened the door. The cold came out. Not a draft, a presence. The cold of a room that was occupied by something that was not air. She stepped inside. The vestibule was dark. She had a flashlight, but she did not turn it on. Hearing mattered more than sight. The sanctuary opened ahead of her. She could see the pews in the faint light from the windows, the green-tinted glass catching the last glow of the sky. And the pews were dark shapes in rows, and the center aisle was a darker lane between them. She counted. She counted out loud, in the dark, from the back left forward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. She crossed the aisle. She started at the back right. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. She paused. 23. There was a 23rd pew. She stopped. She stood in the center aisle, and she looked at the back of the right side, where pew 22 should have been the last in the row, and there was one more pew behind it, against the east wall, where there had not been a pew that morning, where there had not been a pew any of the 12 times she had counted, and it was there, dark oak and iron, matching the others exactly. And it was occupied. There was someone sitting in the 23rd pew. Nora could not see them clearly. The light was wrong. The faint green glow of the old glass, and the figure was in shadow, and it was sitting very still. It was a woman. She could see that much. A woman sitting in the last pew, in the dark, with her hands on her knees, and the woman was humming, not singing. Humming. A low, tuneless, off-key hum, the kind of hum that a woman makes when she is not thinking about making it, when her mind is somewhere else and her body is just running on the sound, the way a stove runs on a pilot light. And Nora Selwick stood in the center aisle of Coulter Methodist Church at 7:30 on a Saturday evening in October, and listened to her mother hum. She knew it was not her mother. She knew it the way you know a dream is a dream even while you are in it. The humming was too even. June Selwick's humming had hitches in it, small syncopations where her breathing caught or where she started a melody and lost it and went back to the formless hum, and this humming did not have those hitches. It was smooth. It was continuous. It was the humming of something that had learned to hum by listening to humming but had never breathed while doing it. And then the figure turned its head, slightly, and Nora could see its profile, and it was her mother's profile, the nose and the chin and the way the hair fell, and the figure raised one hand and pressed the thumbnail into the pad of the index finger, click, and held it for 4 seconds, and released it, and pressed again. And the figure said, in June Selwick's voice, in the voice that had sung flat and loud and wrong for 31 years, it said, "Nora, honey, come sit down." And Nora Selwick, standing in the dark in a church that was not hers, with a thing in it that was not her mother, felt her feet start to move. She felt them start to move toward the 23rd pew. She felt the grief in her body pull her forward the way a current pulls a swimmer, and she felt the 3 years of missing her mother, the 3 years of the empty house and the silent choir, and the 2 notes that never became a hymn, pull her toward that pew the way a root pulls toward water. and she took one step. And the figure in the pew said the thing that stopped her. It said, "I have missed you so much, Nora. Come sit down and let me hold you. And reach into your bag and get me something for this smell. Something in here smells like camphor. And you know how I love camphor. You know how I love camphor." The gap. June Selwick hated camphor, hated it with a hatred that predated memory, that was older than reason, that drove her out of rooms and away from coats, and that had been the single most consistent fact of her sensory life for 58 years. And the thing in the 23rd pew had said, "You know how I love camphor." It had gotten it wrong. It had gotten the direction wrong. Love instead of hate. Come close instead of go away. The one thing it could not learn. The one thing Margaret Voss had identified. The one gap that 53 years of practice had not closed. It did not know the difference between attraction and repulsion. It did not know that the smell of camphor was the one thing in the world that would have made June Selwick stand up and leave. And Nora Selwick stopped. She stopped with one foot forward, in the center aisle, with the thing in the 23rd pew wearing her mother's face and her mother's voice and her mother's hands, and she said, out loud, in a voice that was shaking but clear, "My mother hated camphor." And the thing in the pew went still, and Nora said, she hated it. She hated it more than anything. And you do not know that, because you do not know her, because you are not her, because you have her voice and her hands and her hymns, and you do not have her. You have the shape of her, and you do not have the woman, and you have never had the woman, and you will never have the woman, because the woman is gone, and what is gone, and I will not answer you, and you cannot keep me, and my name is Nora Selwick, and there are 22 pews in this church. 22. She said the number, and the 23rd pew was gone. Not slowly, not fading, gone. Between one heartbeat and the next, the 23rd pew was not there, and the figure was not there, and the humming was not there, and the east wall was bare where the pew had been, and the floor was unmarked, and the church was empty, and the cold was lifting, and Nora Selwick was standing alone in the center aisle of an ordinary church on an October evening, and she was alive. She walked out. The door swung closed. She put the padlock on the hasp and clicked it shut. She walked down the 5 limestone steps. The car waited in the dark. She drove 14 miles to Goshen. Not once did she look back. In the morning, at 7:45, Deputy Lyle Ott of the Harshaw County Sheriff's Department went into Coulter Methodist Church. He went because Harlan Jessamine had called the sheriff's office at 7 a.m. and said, "I need a deputy to come out and look at the church. I need him to bring a camera. I need him to photograph the inside of the building before anybody goes in. And I need it done now." Lyle Ott was 29 years old. He had been a deputy for 4 years. He had been to Coulter exactly twice, both times for stray cattle on the road, and he knew nothing about the church and nothing about the lock and nothing about any of this. He drove out. He met Harlan in the gravel lot. Harlan unlocked the front door and stood aside and said, "Go in and photograph everything, and then come out and tell me what you see." Lyle Ott went in. He photographed the interior of Coulter Methodist Church from the vestibule to the chancel. He took 26 photographs with a department Polaroid. Those photographs are in the incident file at the Harshaw County Sheriff's Department, file number 97-341, and I have seen 9 of them. In the 9 photographs I have seen, the church looks exactly as Nora Selwick described it. White walls, pressed tin ceiling, wood floor, windows, altar, cross, pews, 23 pews, 11 on the left, 12 on the right. A 23rd pew against the east wall, behind the last row on the right side, matching the others in every detail. Oak and iron, bolted to the floor, with a hymnal in the rack, open, face down, on page 216. And in the 23rd pew, on the seat, a scarf. Dark green wool. Old. Folded neatly. Smelling, when Lyle Ott picked it up, of camphor. Lyle Ott came out and told Harlan Jessamine what he saw. And Harlan said, "Count the pews." And Lyle said, 23. And Harlan said, there should be 22. And Lyle Ott, who was a reasonable young man with a badge and a camera and no patience for rural superstition, said, "Well, there are 23, and stood there looking at the old man's face and said, "Is there a problem?" And Harlan Jessamine said, "Yes, sir, there is a problem." And he did not say what the problem was, and he locked the door, and he went home. The incident file was opened on the 19th of October, 1997, and closed on the 22nd, 3 days later, with a notation that reads, "No evidence of criminal activity. Church building secured. Extra pew of unknown origin noted. No further action. Extra pew of unknown origin. 4 words doing an enormous amount of work. The 23rd pew was there on the 19th. It was photographed on the 19th. On the 20th, a Sunday, the congregation came in for the morning service, and the 23rd pew was there, and 31 people sat in 22 pews and looked at the 23rd, and nobody sat in it, and the service went on. On Monday, the 21st, Harlan Jessamine went in to check, and the 23rd pew was there. On Tuesday, the 22nd, he went in again, and it was gone, not removed, gone. The floor where it had been was unmarked. No bolt holes, no scratches, no dust pattern, as though it had never been there, except that it was in the photographs. It exists in the photographs. 26 Polaroids, 9 of which I have seen, and in every one of them the 23rd pew is there, solid, real, casting a shadow on the floor that matches the shadows of the other 22. And there is a hymnal in the rack, open, face down, on page 216, and on that page is the first line of, "Come, thou fount of every blessing." That is where the case stands. That is the artifact that cannot be explained, the thing that the photographs say was there and the floor says was not, and nobody, in 27 years, has been able to reconcile those two facts. Nora Selwick drove back to Springfield on the morning of the 19th. She wrote her report. She recommended full funding for the roof and foundation repairs. She submitted it to the Ozark's Heritage Foundation on the 28th of October, 1997. The foundation approved the grant in December. The repairs were completed in the spring and summer of 1998 by a crew from Ava, Missouri, and the crew foreman, a man named Bert Wickersham, later said that in 3 months on the job, not one of his men would stay past 4 in the afternoon, and that 2 of them quit after the first week, and that he himself, a man who had worked on buildings for 30 years, had never been in a structure that felt the way that one felt, and that he was not going to say any more about it than that. The church stands. The roof is sound. The foundation is repaired. The 22 pews are in their rows. The services continue every Sunday. 37 people in 1997, 19 people in 2024. Getting fewer. Getting older. And every night, Harlan Jessamine walks up the steps and locks the doors. Harlan Jessamine is 98 years old. He has been locking the church every night since 1946. 78 years. His hands shake. His knees are bad. The steps are hard. But he goes up every night with the padlocks, and he locks the front and the side and the root cellar, and he walks home, and he does not look back. Now, let me tell you about Nora Selwick. Nora Selwick is 61 years old. She lives in Springfield. She still works in historic preservation. Her colleagues have noticed things about her, but they have noticed things. She keeps a jar of camphor in her car, open. A small glass jar on the passenger seat. The camphor is not a ward. It is not a weapon. It is a measurement, because the thing under the church got the camphor wrong. It said love instead of hate, and as long as Nora can smell the camphor and feel repelled by it, the way her mother would have been repelled by it, as long as the smell of camphor makes her think of her mother leaving a room instead of entering one, the gap is still there. The gap between what the mouth knows and what is real. The gap that Margaret Voss spent 7 years measuring. And on the nights when Nora Selwick wakes at 3 in the morning and hears singing, which she does, still, 27 years later, not often, not every night, but sometimes, on certain nights, on nights when the wind is from the southwest, from the direction of Coulter, 140 miles away, on those nights she hears it, faint, far, a single voice singing, "Come, thou fount of every blessing," flat and loud and wrong, and she reaches for the camphor, and she holds the jar under her nose, and she breathes it in, and the singing stops. Because the singing comes in love, and the camphor is hate, and the two cannot occupy the same space, and the mouth still does not know the difference. That is the gap. That is the only thing between Nora Selwick and the door, and it is getting smaller. She told me that. She told me, in the one conversation she agreed to have, that the singing is getting closer to right, not the pitch. The pitch has been right for years. The voice has been right for years. It is the feeling that is getting closer. She said she used to be able to hear the wrongness in it the way you hear a wrong note in a chord, immediately, obviously, without thinking about it. She said now she has to listen. Concentration is required. The camphor has to be held to her nose and close her eyes and focus on the gap, and some nights she can barely find it. She said, "It is learning. Still, after 146 years, it is still learning. And it is learning the one thing it has never been able to learn, the thing that Margaret Voss said it could not learn, the thing that the whole case turns on. It is learning the difference between love and hate." And she said, the night it learns that, the night the camphor stops working, the night the singing sounds right not just in the voice and the pitch and the words, but in the feeling of it, that is the night she packs a bag and drives south, and she does not know what she will do when she gets to Coulter, but she knows she has to be there, because somebody has to be there when the gap closes. Somebody has to be there on the last Sunday, because the church cannot interrupt itself, and the 22 pews cannot count themselves, and somebody has to say their name into the room one more time, or the mouth will open, and the ground will take what the ground has been waiting for. She does not know if she is strong enough. She said that plainly. She said, "I am 61 years old, and I have been counting for 27 years, and I am tired, and the singing is beautiful, and my mother has been dead for 30 years. And some nights the gap is so small I could close it myself by stepping through, and some nights I want to," she said. That is the part nobody tells you about these stories. The horror is not that the thing is coming for you. The horror is that part of you wants it to come, because the thing it is offering is not darkness and not death and not damnation. It is your mother's voice, singing the hymn she loved, in the church you were raised in, and it is saying your name, and it is saying, "Come sit down," and every cell in your body wants to sit down. And the only thing stopping you is a jar of camphor and the memory of a woman who hated it. Now, there is one more thing I have to tell you, and it is the thing that June Selwick said to Nora in the last 11 days of her life, the thing Nora has never told anyone, the thing that was in the file that Nora did not know would be opened. June Selwick, in the morphine fog of her last days, in the hospital in Springfield, said this to her daughter, "Nora, honey, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it, and I need you to remember it, because it is the most important thing I know," she said. "There is a place in the world where the ground listens. I do not know where it is. I have never been there. But I have dreamed about it my whole life, since I was a girl. I dream about a church in a hollow, and in the dream I am singing, and the church is learning my voice, and when I wake up, I can feel it in my chest, the way you can feel a bell after it stops ringing. And I think, when I die, my voice is going to go there. I do not know why I think that, and I do not want to frighten you, but I think my voice is going to go into the ground in that place, and I think it is going to sing there, and I think someone will hear it, and I want you to know that if you hear me singing, it is not a trick, and it is not a ghost, and it is not a monster. It is me. It is the only part of me that goes on, and it goes into the ground, and it sings. June Selwick said that in March of 1994, she died 8 days later. Nora did not go to Coulter for another 3.5 years. And when she got there, the church was singing in her mother's voice, and the voice was flat and loud and wrong, and it knew the hymns, and it knew the name, and it knew everything about June Selwick except the camphor. But she keeps the camphor fresh, and every Sunday she drives to First Methodist in Springfield, and she sits in the second row, front left, the seat that was her mother's for 31 years, and she sings. She sings flat and loud and wrong, the way her mother sang, and the choir director does not complain, because choir directors learn, and the congregation does not mind, because congregations forget. And if you asked her why she does it, she would tell you the same thing she told me on the one afternoon I spent with her in the kitchen of her house on the east side of Springfield, with the camphor in the window and the cat on the counter, and the light coming in the way light comes in when a day is nearly over. She said, "I sing because the only way to keep a voice alive is to use it. And I sing badly because my mother sang badly, and that is the truth of her, and the truth is the only thing the mouth cannot learn. It can learn the pitch and the words and the rhythm and the breath. It cannot learn the truth. It cannot learn that my mother sang badly on purpose, because she loved the songs more than she loved the sound, and that she would rather sing wrong and mean it than sing right and not. And that is the gap. That is the whole gap. The gap that Margaret Voss spent 7 years measuring. The gap that Nora Selwick has spent 27 years holding open with a jar of camphor and a seat in the second row. The gap is this. The mouth sings to be heard. June Selwick sang to sing, and until the mouth understands that distinction, the 23rd pew stays empty, and the last Sunday stays postponed, and the lock stays on the outside of the door. Now I want to go back one more time. Deputy Lyle Ott took 26 photographs that morning. 25 went in the file. The 26th he kept. It was a close-up of the 23rd pew, and in the hymnal rack, behind the open hymnal, there was a second book, a composition notebook, black, marbled cover. Inside, in a hand that Ott described as a child's imitation of an adult's writing, was a copy of Margaret Voss's journal. The photograph is of the 23rd pew, close up, taken from the center aisle, looking east, at a distance of about 4 feet. It shows the pew, the oak seat, the iron end support, the hymnal rack with the open hymnal on page 216. It shows the scarf, green wool, folded on the seat, and it shows, in the hymnal rack, behind the open hymnal, a second book, not a hymnal, a smaller book, a notebook, black, marbled cover, the kind of composition book that a school teacher would use. Lyle Ott kept the photograph and the copy, and he has them still. He lives in Joplin now. He would not talk to me. He said one thing. I went into a church, and I counted the pews, and there were too many, and in the pew that should not have been there, I found a book that something had written by hand in the dark, and the book was a study guide. A study guide. The mouth had read Margaret Voss's journal. It had read it through the floor, through the membrane, through the loose boards that are the speaker and the lid. It had read 7 years of observations about itself, and it had copied them the way a student copies a teacher's notes, and it had left the copy in the 23rd pew, in the hymnal rack, behind the open hymnal, where anyone who sat down in that pew would find it. An invitation and a study guide. A seat and a textbook. The mouth had not only made a place for someone to sit, it had made a place for someone to learn what Margaret Voss had learned, to learn the gap, to learn what it was getting wrong. And the worst thing about that, the thing that made Lyle Ott leave law enforcement and made me set the photograph down and not pick it up again for 3 days, is the implication. The mouth was not trying to close the gap from its side. It was trying to teach someone to close it from the human side. It was trying to find a student. And the 23rd pew is the classroom. And the study guide is the syllabus. And the student has not sat down yet. But the pew keeps appearing. Nora told me that. She told me that the 23rd pew has appeared 3 more times since 1997, in 2004, in 2013, in 2021, always for a few days, always with the hymnal open to the same page, always with the scarf, and each time Harlan Jessamine, or Harlan Jr., has counted 23 and locked the doors and waited, and each time the pew has gone, and each time it has stayed a little longer than the time before. 3 days in 97, 5 days in 04, 9 days in 13, 14 days in 21, getting longer. The way everything about this case gets longer. The way the singing gets longer, and the practice gets longer, and the gap gets smaller. And Nora said, "It is patient. Whatever it is patient. It has been here for 300 years, maybe longer, and it has been studying for 146, and it is in no hurry. It will keep putting the pew out. It will keep leaving the study guide. It will keep singing at 3 in the morning in the voice of every dead person anyone in that hollow has ever loved. And one night, in some year, someone will sit down, and the mouth will have its student, and the student will teach the mouth the one thing it cannot learn by itself. And the last Sunday will come, and the ground will open, and whatever is under Coulter Methodist Church will hold its own service, in its own voice, in its own pew, with its own congregation of the dead, and the names on the walls will answer, and the graves in the oval will shift and sink and settle, and the church will pray downward, the way it has always prayed downward, and the sound will go into the stone, and the stone will open, and the hollow will be quiet, and the lock will be on the outside of an empty door. Now, there is a question I have been holding since the beginning of this story, and I am going to ask it now. Why does the church face south? Every other church in the county faces east, toward Jerusalem, toward the rising sun, toward the resurrection. Coulter Methodist Church faces due south, and no one in 146 years has been able to say why, except Opaline Call, and Opaline Call said it once to Nora Selwick on the night before Nora left Coulter, and what she said was this. She said, "The church does not face south. The church faces the road. The road comes from the south. County Road 12 enters the hollow from the south, through the cedars, past the cemetery, and arrives at the church from the south. And the front door faces the road. And the front door is the door that gets locked. And the lock is the thing between the mouth and the world." And Opaline said, "My grandmother said the church faces the road because the mouth faces the road. The mouth does not look up. The mouth does not look at the sky. The mouth looks at the road, because the road is where the people come from, and the people are what the mouth wants. The church faces the road the way a spider's web faces the path. It was not built to worship toward Jerusalem. It was built to catch what comes up the road." And Nora Selwick, driving back to Springfield on the morning of the 19th of October, 1997, 140 miles from Coulter, thought about that, and she thought about Dale Elkins backing his truck out of the clearing, rather than turning around in front of the church, and she thought about Harlan Jessamine backing out, and she thought about Clement Race, the stonemason, going over the ridge, rather than taking the road home. They all left the same way. They all left without showing the church their faces. They all left without letting the front door see them go, because the front door faces the road, and the mouth behind the front door faces the road. And if you turn your car around in the clearing, you turn your face to the door, and for 1 second, 1/2 second, you are facing the mouth, and the mouth is facing you, and in that 1/2 second, it has your face, the way it has your name, the way it has your voice, the way it has every part of you that you have ever shown it. And Nora Selwick did not turn around in the clearing. She backed out, the way everyone does, the way everyone in Coulter has done for 119 years. She backed 14 miles to Goshen, because behind her is south, and south is the direction the mouth is looking. I have one more thing to say, and then I will let you go. In December of 2023, the Harshaw County Assessor's Office conducted a routine property survey of Coulter Methodist Church as part of a county-wide revaluation. The assessor, a woman named Janelle Pruitt, age 32, drove out to Coulter on a Tuesday afternoon, measured the building, took 11 photographs, and drove home. In the report she filed with the county, there is a single note in the remarks section. It reads, "Interior, in good condition for age. Original pews, in good repair. Note, counted 22 pews during site visit. Photo 7 shows 23. Discrepancy attributed to parallax or counting error. Photo 7. I have seen Photo 7. It is a wide-angle shot of the sanctuary from the vestibule, looking north toward the altar. The pews are clearly visible, 11 on the left, 12 on the right, 23. Janelle Pruitt counted 22 in person and photographed 23, and she called it a counting error. And in the 23rd pew, in Photo 7, barely visible, at the limit of the resolution, there is something dark on the seat. A shape. It could be a scarf. It could be a shadow. It could be nothing. And behind the hymnal, in the rack, if you look very carefully, if you enlarge the image until the pixels swim, there is the edge of something black. The corner of a book. The 23rd pew is still appearing. The study guide is still there. The seat is still empty. And the mouth is still waiting. And the church still faces the road. I need to tell you one more thing. And this is the thing I have been putting off, because I do not like the weight of it, and because once I tell you, you will carry it. And I am sorry about that, but it is part of the case, and I will not leave it out. In December of 2021, during the 14-day appearance, a woman drove up County Road 12 in a car with Tennessee plates. She told Harlan Jr. she had been dreaming about this place her whole life. A white church in a hollow, with a bell tower and no bell. Harlan Jr. saw her from his yard. He walked over. He asked her if she needed help. She gave her name. It was a name on the list of 27, an old Harshaw County name that does not exist anywhere else in the country. Harlan Jr. told her the church was closed. She drove off and did not come back. He asked her name. She left. She drove back down County Road 12. She did not come back on Sunday. She did not come back at all. But Harlan Jr. called Nora Selwick that night, and he told her about the woman, and he told her the name, and Nora was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "It is calling them home. It is using the names, the 27 names, the ones it has had the longest, the ones that are deepest in the stone. It is using those names to call the descendants back, the way a church calls its congregation, the way a voice calls a name. It is reaching out along the lines of blood and name and inheritance, and it is finding the ones who carry the old names, and it is pulling them toward Coulter, and it is doing it with dreams. Dreams of a white church in a hollow, dreams of a bell tower with no bell, dreams of singing, and one of them will come on a Sunday, and one of them will sit in the 23rd pew, and the last Sunday will begin. And when it does, the lock on the outside of the door will not matter, because the student will already be inside, and the mouth will have what it has been waiting for, and the ground will hear its own name spoken in a voice it understands, and the ground will answer, and the answer will be the opening, and the opening will be the end, unless somebody counts. Unless somebody stands in the center aisle and counts to 22 and says their name and says, "There are 22 pews in this church, and I am the living one, and you are not." Unless somebody holds the gap, that is where the case stands. That is where it has stood for 27 years. An old woman with a jar of camphor and a count of 22, holding a gap the size of the difference between love and hate, in a church that faces the road, in a hollow that listens, in a county that does not appear on the state highway map, and the singing goes on. Have you ever walked past a church at night and heard singing? Not music, not a recording, not the wind in the eaves. Singing, one voice or many voices, coming from inside a building with the lights off and the doors locked, and you stopped and you listened and you told yourself it was nothing, and you walked on. And have you ever wondered, walking on, what would have happened if you had not walked on, if you had stood there in the dark, in front of a building you did not know, and listened long enough to recognize the voice? What would you have done? Would you have tried the door? I think you would have. I think most of us would have. I think that is the whole trouble with being human. We hear a voice we love and we go toward it, and we do not stop to count the pews, and we do not stop to say our name, and we open the door, and we sit down, and the singing goes on, and the gap closes, and the lock is on the wrong side. If you have been with me this long, I want to thank you for staying. I know 3 hours is a long time to sit in the dark with a story like this one. I know it is the kind of story that stays with you, that sits in the back of your mind when you are trying to sleep, that makes you listen a little harder when the house is quiet and the wind is up. If you have a story like this one, if there is a church in your county or a building in your town that people lock from the outside without explaining why, I want to hear about it. Put it in the comments. I do not promise I will make a case out of it. I do promise I will read it. The collection is in the description. What the congregation left behind: 10 churches, 4 states, 9 hours. Meant to be listened to late and low and alone. And the next case is already written. I cannot tell you the name of the town yet, because I have not been given permission, and in this work permission matters. But I can tell you this. The next one is not a church. The next one is a bridge. And the bridge does not connect 2 pieces of land. The bridge connects 2 pieces of time. And the people who cross it at the wrong hour do not come back the same. That is all I am going to say about it. Now, one last thing. Nora Selwick asked me, at the end of our conversation, to say one thing on her behalf. She said, "If you tell this, tell them this." She said, "Count your pews, whatever room you are in, whatever building you are in. Count the seats. Count them out loud. And when you are done, say your name. Say it clearly. Say it the way you would say it to a room that was listening, because every room is listening. That is what rooms do. They take in the sound of the people inside them, and they hold it, and they play it back in their own time, in their own way, and most rooms play it back as an echo, as a creak, as a draft, as that feeling you get when you walk into an old building and feel like you are interrupting something. Most rooms are harmless, but some rooms are built on a mouth, and the mouth does not echo. The mouth remembers, and the mouth practices, and the mouth is patient, and the mouth is hungry, and the mouth has been waiting for 300 years, and it knows your mother's name. Count the pews. Say your name, and if you count 1 too many, leave. Sleep with the doors locked from the outside, and the camphor on the windowsill, and the voice you love the most in the world tucked safely inside your own chest, where nothing in the ground can reach it. Good night. I will see you on the next long night.